Hello, and welcome. Whether you're settling into bed beneath a soft blanket or listening during a quiet moment of your day, this gentle journey invites you to drift back through time. Make yourself comfortable, let your breathing slow, let your thoughts loosen, and allow the day's weight to slip away. Together, we'll travel more than 1,000 years into the past, out across the cold northern seas, where the Viking world unfolded between sky and water. This is You Wouldn't Survive a Viking Winter at Sea, a calm and soothing exploration of the realities behind the longships that crossed stormy horizons. Take a slow, deep breath. As you exhale, imagine the soft creaking of wooden planks beneath your feet, rocking gently with the movement of distant waves. Picture the pale light of a winter sun struggling through thick clouds, casting a quiet silver glow across the expanse of icy water. In this peaceful retelling, we leave behind the roar of battles and the ferocity of storms, focusing instead on the quiet endurance, the frigid conditions, and the unwavering determination that shaped life aboard a Viking ship during the coldest months of the year. Now, imagine yourself standing on the deck of a longship at dawn. The air is sharp, crisp enough to sting the lungs. Your breath curls into the sky like small drifting clouds. Around you, the sea stretches in every direction, calm for now, gently rising and falling with a steady rhythm. Nearby, crew members move quietly, adjusting ropes, tending to supplies, and sharing low murmurs in the early light. You might be resting comfortably at home, but a part of you can almost feel the chill across your skin and hear the slow splash of water along the hull. Let your worries drift outward across the deep, open sea. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the challenges that made winter voyages so demanding, how freezing winds tested the strength of even the bravest sailors, how supplies had to be rationed carefully over long distances, and how endless nights and cold waves shaped both body and spirit. We'll listen to the quiet crackle of fire in a small iron brazier, feel the weight of heavy wool cloaks, and watch the faint glow of the northern lights ripple across the sky above weary travelers. Through it all, we'll move slowly and gently, letting each scene unfold like a soft, shimmering reflection on the water. Now that you're calm and relaxed, let's begin this serene voyage into the heart of the Viking winter sea. Our first chapter begins with the ship itself, the sturdy longship, the tools, the provisions, and the careful planning needed to survive the cold, northern waters. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the quiet magic of the Norse world carry you onward. And if you enjoy this peaceful exploration, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can drift into many more calming journeys through history. The Call of the Northern Sea. A long, low Viking longship slipped away from the icy fjord at dawn, its hull creaking softly as it met the swells of the open sea. The vessel was narrow and sturdy, built with overlapping oak planks in the clinker style that let it flex over the waves. 20 souls formed her crew, each bundled in, woolen cloaks and furs against the bitter cold. Their breath mingled in pale clouds above the deck as they rowed in steady rhythm, departing the last sight of familiar shores. Despite the urgency of their voyage, A hush lay over the men, a quiet reverence for the journey ahead and the dire, unforgiving winter sea awaiting them. No cheer rose as the land faded. Only the haunting call of a lone gull followed them out. Each man felt the weight of the northern sea's call, that deep sense of fate pulling them onward. The sky was streaked with pink and gold light, but the sun held little warmth on this late autumn morning. Frost clung to the ship's ropes and the beards of the oarsmen. Still, the crew took strength in their purpose. At the prow stood Eric, the helmsman and leader, one hand on the carved dragon-head prow, as if greeting the horizon. In his other hand, he clutched a small wooden charm of Njord, god of wind and sea, praying in silence for safe passage and fair winds. They had departed later in the season than wise sailors would prefer. Early winter already gripped the north, but an urgent mission drove them to bring much-needed supplies to a distant settlement before the deep winter set in, or so the rumor went. Others whispered that Eric sought out new lands spoken of in sagas, far isles beyond the horizon, and refused to wait for spring. Whatever the reason, turning back was not an option now. They had committed themselves to the winter sea's mercy. Before dawn, on the pebble beach where they launched, the crew had performed a small blot, a sacred offering to the gods. Under the dim light of guttering torches, they led a goat to the water's edge. Each man had wet his fingers with the animal's blood and flicked drops into the waves, murmuring invocations. All-Father Odin, watch us. Njord, steer us. Thor, give us strength, they whispered, believing the sacrifice would strengthen the gods and in turn earn their favor. Then they feasted briefly on the cooked meat and mead, a communal meal to seal the ritual and fortify their bellies. Even as they ate, snowflakes had swirled in the air. It was an ominous sign, winter's herald arriving early. Some glanced at one another in the firelight with worry, but none spoke aloud their fear. Superstition ran deep. To speak of ill fortune might invite it. Now, as the oars took the ship beyond the fjord's mouth, the last echoes of that shore faded. A few crewmen glanced back at the receding coastline, jagged rocks soon lost in morning mist. Young Leif, barely a man at 17 winters, watched his homeland vanish with mingled excitement and homesickness. This was his first journey far from home. He pressed a hand to a small pendant under his cloak, a carved amber of his mother's. Drawing comfort from it, he thought of her waving from the dock, her face proud but eyes shining with tears as the ship had pushed off. Leif inhaled the salt air and straightened. He was determined to prove himself worthy on this voyage, no matter what the sea might bring. In these first hours, spirits were cautiously high. The sea was calm but cold, stretching out like pewter under the pale sun. The men shipped their oars and hoisted the sail to catch a northeasterly breeze. The square sail, coloured in faded stripes of red and yellow, bellied out, and the longships surged forward. Water gurgled along the strakes as they picked up speed. Some of the crew gave a gentle cheer at this sign of good progress. A fair wind was seen as the gods' first blessing. The ship itself, christened Havbrave by Eric, meaning sea brave, lived up to her name. She rode the waves with ease, the flexible hull bending rather than battering against the swell. Eric had overseen her construction himself 2 summers ago. As a result, he trusted this ship like an old friend. The oak planks were cleaved and hewn expertly, retaining the wood's strength and spring. He knew each timber and joint. Standing by the tiller at the stern, Eric would occasionally run his calloused hand along the gunwale, as if reassuring the vessel, or himself. There were no cabins or below decks on this open longship. All was exposed under the wide sky. The men were at the mercy of the elements here, for now that mercy was mild. Only a light snow fell, melting on the deck. The crew pulled up a bit of oiled canvas to cover the central section of the ship, their only semblance of a shelter. Under this tent-like tarp, they stowed extra gear, coils of rope, spare sailcloth, and provisions packed in wooden chests. Barrels of fresh water and ale were lashed securely, along with sacks of dried fish, smoked mutton, and hard bread for the resorous journey. These supplies were calculated to last some weeks if rationed carefully. Still, each man quietly hoped they would reach landfall before having to stretch those rations too thin. As the hours passed and the sun climbed only weakly, the crew settled into the routine of the voyage. They divided into shifts, some men tending the sail and rigging, some resting under cloaks, and others taking watch on the bow and stern. On a Viking ship, life aboard fell into a rhythm, periods of relative calm, punctuated by bursts of action when adjusting to wind and wave. During calmer moments, like this morning, men would tell stories or sing to pass the time. Indeed, an older warrior named Styr wove a tale now to lift spirits. In a low, gravelly voice, Styr recounted a legend of Thor fishing for Jörmungandr, the world serpent. The men listened with half smiles as they performed their tasks. Thor cast his line into the sea, with a great ox head for bait, Styr intoned, his eyes gleaming. Down, down, it sank into the black depths, and the serpent, that mighty serpent that encircles all Midgard, he took the bait. Leif, coiling a rope nearby, mouthed the familiar words along with the storyteller. Thor pulled with all his godly strength. The ocean boiled in fury as Jörmungandr thrashed. The thunder god's muscles bulged. He strained mightily, and at last the serpent's head broke the surface, huge as a hill, dripping venom and blood. Styr mimed the pacet, act, and a couple of men made a show of gripping imaginary fishing lines and grunting, prompting quiet laughter. Thor reached for his hammer to strike the killing blow, but alas, here Styr paused dramatically. The giant Hymir, who was Thor's boatmate, feared the sight of the beast, and action cut the line. The serpent plunged back into the deep and escaped. A few men tutted or shook their heads in mock disappointment at Hymir's cowardice. One called out, "If it were me, I'd have held fast by Thor," and the others chuckled. The mood was light for the moment, hearts warmed by myth and camaraderie. It was comforting to invoke the gods through these stories, a reminder that even the all-powerful faced perils in the sea. If Thor himself wrestled monsters in these waters, then mortal sailors could feel less alone in their own struggles. By midday, the coast was completely lost to view. All around them stretched the slate-grey expanse of the North Sea, waves gently churning. The wind was steady and cold, pushing Havbrav westward along their intended route. Eric navigated by the weak winter sun whenever it peeked through the cloud cover. He used a small, wooden sun compass at noon, a disc with a gnomon that cast a shadow, allowing him to gauge their latitude by the sun's height. On overcast days, He'd planned to use a special crystal, a solarstein, or sunstone, said to reveal the hidden sun's position in the sky. Many scoffed at such things, but some sailors swore by them. Eric kept the calcite crystal wrapped in cloth in his chest, ready for need. He was determined to keep on course, even if the sun and stars were hidden. For now, though, he had good visibility. By his reckoning, they would reach the Shetland Islands in several days if the wind held. There they might rest briefly before the next leap across open ocean. That was the plan, at least, to hop from one known point to another on the way to their distant goal. It was risky to strike out into the winter seas, but less so if one could break it into stages. However, as all sailors know, the sea often laughs at mortal plans. Eric tried not to dwell on uncertainties. He squinted at the southwestern horizon, watching the band of clouds. The weather looked calm enough, and yet a twinge of unease tugged at him. Winter weather could change with alarming speed. He murmured a quiet chant under his breath, an old prayer to Aegir, the sea giant, and his wife Ran. Aegir, let your daughters, the waves, cradle us gently. Ran, do not take us in your net. We are not ready for your haul, he whispered, fingers brushing the runes carved on the tiller. As dusk approached, such as it was in these latitudes, where daylight was brief, the crew prepared for their first night at sea. The wind began to falter with the sun's decline, so they furled the sail and returned to oars for a time. Rowing in cold air kept their blood moving. Leif's muscles ached by now, but he welcomed the exertion to stay warm. All day, he had felt a mix of thrill and homesickness, but as night neared, a more primal apprehension crept in. Out here, there would be no hearth fire, no soft bed, or even a dry spot to curl up. They arranged the final down, night watches. 3 men would stay awake in rotation through the night, tending the tiller and keeping an eye on the sea and sky. The others would attempt to rest as best they could, huddled under cloaks and the canvas tarp. There was a tacit agreement that everyone got a turn at real sleep, if possible, to keep up strength. Bjarni, a big, broad-shouldered farmer turned raider, volunteered for the first watch, along with 2 others. He sat by the mast, an axe at his side, scanning the dim horizon. The sea had a way of sneaking up on the unwary. Sudden squalls or a rogue wave even on a far, still night. Bjarni resolved that if anything approached, he'd bellow the alarm to rouse all. Until then, he listened to the sound of oars being shipped and the quiet murmur as men settled down. With the sail lowered, Havbrave rocked more gently. Small waves lapped at her hull. The sky became a deep indigo and stars pricked through, one by one. The crew ate a cold meal at sundown. Hard rye bread dipped in ale, a few strips of dried fish. It was not much, but none complained. They chewed slowly, savouring the nourishment and dreaming of the day's end, when perhaps a hot stew might fill their bellies again. Such a day felt far off now. Leif, teeth chattering slightly, found a spot near the bow under the canvas, where he could wedge himself between 2 coil of ropes. He wrapped his wool cloak tightly and pulled a fur hood over his head. Through a gap in the tarp, he could see the first stars. He recognized the North Star, Polaris, the lodestar, steady in the clear northern sky. It gave him comfort to see it, a point of certainty. Many a time his father had pointed out Polaris to him back home, teaching how it always marks north. Now that same star watched over them, like a familiar friend following from afar. As silence fell on the boat, save for the creak of wood and gentle slosh of water, a few men softly hummed an old tune to lull themselves to sleep. It was a cradle song, normally sung to children, its melody simple and soothing. In the strange half-light of the polar evening, for darkness never fell completely this time of year, a ghostly twilight clung at the horizon. The humming mingled with the sea's whisper. Leif closed his eyes, imagining his mother's voice singing similar notes by the hearth. The longship rose and fell in a slow rhythm, nearly lulling even those on watch into a trance. Thus, on the first night, tranquility reigned. The crew of Havbrave drifted into fitful rest, with dreams of home flickering in their tired minds. The northern sea seemed merciful so far, but deep in the darkness beyond the horizon, something was brewing. A distant rumble, a shift in the air pressure, the kind of thing only the gods or perhaps some animal's instinct might sense. The men did not know it yet, but the bitter wind of winter would soon rise, and with it, their true trial would begin. The bitter wind rises. They awoke to change. Dawn came late and weak, casting a steel-blue light over a tumbling sea. Over the course of the night, the gentle rocking had given way to sharp emotions that threw the sleepers against one another. By first light, clouds blanketed the sky in rolling tiers of grey. The air had a bite that cut through even thick wool, and the wind somewhere in the small hours it had swung around to the northwest and grown teeth. Now it blew stiff and unyielding, a bitter wind knifing across the waves and directly against their intended course. Eric had taken the tiller at dawn, relieving a weary Bjarni whose watch had been arduous. Bjarni's face was red and raw from wind exposure, and his normally jovial expression was grim. "The wind rises fierce from Niflheim's gates," he muttered, rubbing his numb hands. During his watch, the seas had begun to swell, and each hour the gusts grew stronger, forcing constant corrections on the tiller. Eric clapped Bjarni's shoulder in thanks and urged him to get some warmth and rest while possible. Now Eric squinted at the leaden horizon, jaw set. White-capped waves reared around them, not huge but foaming and insistent, like wolves snapping at the ship's sides. The longship's bow pitched into each incoming swell, spray flying back over the deck. With every crest, a cascade of frigid salt water doused the men. Though they had no true shelter, they did what they could. They pulled up the edges of the yaffik, canvas, tarp, and hunkered low when waves broke, minimizing exposure. Still, within minutes, everyone was soaked from boots to beard. The water that pooled in the bilges was icy as death and had to be bailed constantly. 2 men took up the task with wooden buckets, working in a steady rhythm to keep the longship from gaining too much weight in water. The wind's bitter cold was soon matched by its raw strength. By mid-morning, it howled around them, tearing at clothes and finding every gap in armor or cloth to sear the skin beneath. The crew's wool cloaks, soaked with seawater, felt heavy, but remained their best protection. The lanolin-rich wool repelled some water and kept insulating even when wet. Those with leather coverings had rubbed them with animal fat to improve waterproofing. But in these onslaughts of spray, no one stayed truly dry for long. The men gritted their teeth and endured, as Vikings must. Quiet prayers to Thor and Odin were on many lips, though often lost in the gale's scream. "Sail down!" Eric roared over the wind. The gusts were growing too fierce for the sail to stay up safely. The brightly striped sail was thrashing, its ropes straining. If they didn't reduce it, the wind could rip the sail or even capsize the ship. At Eric's command, a few men braved the exposed deck to furl the sail. This was hazardous work, climbing on a spray-slick deck, reaching up the mast as the ship bucked. One slip, and a man could be overboard in an instant. But they moved with practiced coordination. These were experienced sailors and warriors who had known rough seas before. Steyr and another nimble fellow, Halfdan, managed to pull the yardarm down partway and gather the sail in, securing it with rough ropes. In that process, a sudden, fierce gust nearly carried Halfdan off. The sailcloth billowed violently, jerking him off his footing. He gave a shout as his boots skidded on the wet wood, but Styr grabbed his arm and he regained balance. Together they wrestled the last of the sail ties fast. They exchanged grim nods of relief and clambered back toward safer positions, clinging to the mast and gunwale for support. With the sail down, progress slowed. Havbrave now faced the growing waves under oar power alone. Rowing in such conditions was grueling. Eric ordered half the men to the oars, keeping others in reserve to swap out frequently, for the effort would exhaust them quickly in the cold. The rowers fought both wind and sea with each stroke. Sometimes a wave lifted the longship, and oars bit into empty air, sending the men lurching. Other times a trough yawned, and an oar would slam hard into water, nearly wrenching from a man's grasp. It took fierce concentration and strength to keep rowing in time, but they knew the alternative was being set completely adrift at the storm's mercy. As the morning wore on, the storm grew to full fury. This was a brutal winter gale, the kind that whips the northern seas into walls of water and needles of ice. Sleet began to mix with the spray, sharp little pellets stinging their faces. The sky darkened to an iron gloom as layers of storm clouds piled overhead, and a kind of twilight fell, though it was not yet noon. The temperature plummeted. Further, you could feel frost forming at the edges of wet clothes when the wind momentarily eased, only to be thawed by the next splash of salt water, a vicious cycle of freezing and soaking. Eric's knuckles were white on the tiller. He worked it constantly, fighting to keep the bow oriented into the oncoming waves. If they were caught broadside, even the flexible longship could capsize or be swamped. Time blurred into a continuous, urgent present, every moment demanding focus. He called out orders hoarsely. Port side, pull, starboard, ease, trying to angle them properly as each wave approached. His voice was nearly lost in the roaring wind, but the crew had sailed with him enough to read his gestures and the situation. At one point, a towering wave rose ahead like a dark green hill, topped with foaming white. The men braced instinctively. Havbrave's dragon prow climbed the steep water mountain, timbers groaning. For an instant on the peak, it felt as if the longship hung in midair, the world nothing but swirling sea and sky. Then the bow tipped downward sickeningly, and they plunged into the trough with a crash. The impact was tremendous. Cold, seawater cascaded over the bow in a thundering rush, as if the sea had reached icy fingers on board. Leif, near the front, was struck full by this wave. The force knocked him back against a rowing bench, and he sputtered, lungs burning from inhaled spray. When he wiped his eyes clear, he saw that, for a moment, the entire deck was awash. Seawater swirled around their ankles and calves, mixed with chunks of ice and sleet. The ship, however, had not been upended. She yielded, but did not break under the blow, the overlapped planks flexing with the pressure. Still, the weight of water on board made her sluggish. "Bail! Bail now!" someone shouted needlessly. The designated bailers were already frantically at work. Two big men tossed bucket after bucket overboard, their movements urgent but methodical. Each heave of water seemed puny against the volume that had come in. But, gradually, Havbrave shed the excess weight and regained her buoyancy. The men exchanged glances of relief. If another wave that size struck before they cleared the first, it could have spelled the end. They silently thanked whatever luck or spirits watched them that it had not. Throughout, the crew's spirits were tested. Fear was a presence on that boat, unspoken, perhaps even denied, but present all the same. Each man dealt with it in his own way. Some held rage against the storm, as if battling an enemy. Bjarni cursed oaths at the wind, promising to smash any Jotun, gaursing. This weather, if only he could reach them. Others turned inward, focusing on rote tasks like rowing or bailing as a shield against panic. Leif found himself silently reciting a childhood prayer to Thor for courage, over and over, timed with each breath. The words were simple: "Mighty Thor, steady my heart. Strong Thor, guide my hands." It helped him stay centered, imagining the thunder god's steady presence amid chaos. Despite the clamor, there were strangely beautiful moments in the storm. Briefly, the clouds parted to reveal a slice of sky where the winter sun struggled through. In that diffuse light, the spray flying off the waves glittered like shards of crystal. One crewman, a quiet fisherman named Arnor, actually smiled through blue lips as he beheld it. To him, those glints were like Ran's net, the fabled golden net of the sea goddess Ran, glistening as she cast it, for souls. But she won't have mine today, Arnor whispered to himself, gripping the gunwale and absorbing the fierce beauty of the raging sea. Then the clouds slammed shut again, and the world returned to grey tumult. Snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes, swirling with the salt spray. Soon the men's hair and beards were crusted with ice crystals, giving them the appearance of spectres or frost giants themselves. The temperature drop grew dangerous. Fingertips went numb inside soggy gloves, and feet lost feeling in waterlogged boots. Stomping, or flexing toes, was almost impossible when braced on the boat, but they tried when they could, knowing that stillness could invite frostbite. Amid the struggle, Eric consulted with Svend, his second in command, during a brief lull. They crouched together near the stern, shouting to hear each other. "We cannot make headway west in this wind," Svend warned. He pointed to the angry northwest where they aimed. It was futile. The wind pushed them back, or sideways each time. Eric knew he was right. With the sail down, they had lost speed, and rowing directly into such wind and waves might break the crew before long. "We may have to lie a hull," Eric shouted back, meaning to stop rowing and let the ship drift under minimal steering, riding out the storm with the bow into the waves. It was risky if near land, but here at least they were in open sea, no rocks looming, so far as they knew. Svend nodded. Agreement. Better to preserve strength and not break the ship apart. With a heavy heart, Eric gave the order: stow oars, hold her steady to the waves, and ride it out. The men at oars gratefully ceased their exhausting stroke. They secured the oars along the sides. Now, instead of fighting to go forward, they turned the ship's nose as directly into the oncoming seas as possible and let her drift with wind and current. Two men remained at the tiller to keep alignment as best as possible, correcting as each swell passed. The immediate effect was paradoxically calming. A weight of "oh my" expectation lifted. They were no longer straining to advance, only to survive. The longship now rose and fell with the rhythm of the storm, like a gull riding the swells. Waves still broke over them, and the wind still howled, but without the added momentum of rowing, they could anticipate and respond more freely to the sea's movements. The crew tucked themselves down low, conserving body heat and energy. Some used spare ropes to lash themselves to parts of the ship, mast, benches, etc., a safeguard against being tossed overboard by a sudden jolt. This way, if a man lost his footing, the rope might save him from going into the drink. Hours passed in this state. It was hard to measure time. The sun never clearly showed, hidden behind storm clouds. Day could have been mistaken for dusk in that dim winter tempest. The ordeal seemed endless. Muscles quivered with exhaustion from bracing constantly. Throats were raw from inhaling frigid air and salt. But the Vikings endured, drawing on an age-old well of stubborn resilience. They reminded themselves that their ancestors had crossed these seas in open boats just as frail, that not all who sail perish. At one point, Styr started a chant to keep morale, a deep, droning song that could be heard under the wind's roar. It was an ancient verse used by oarsmen to time their strokes, but now he and others sang it more as a prayer, a low her, rising and falling like the waves themselves. Melody was simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic. Those who weren't bailing or holding ropes added their voices. The sound bound them together, each man feeling the presence of the others through the dismal storm, a shared heartbeat of song in the chaos. Leif sang, too, between chattering teeth, and found it gave him strength. The words invoked Egir's hall, asking for the kind of hospitality that even that wild sea god might grant in sparing their lives. Egir, grant us passage safe, O Ran, Let no nets fall. We sing on waves. We fight the strafe. Sea Father, hear our call. The exact Old Norse phrasing was arcane, but its sentiment clear. Perhaps the gods did hear, or perhaps it was mere luck and the nature of storms. But gradually, after what felt like a lifetime in darkness, the wind began to abate. It was not sudden. Rather, one became aware that the shriek around one's ears had lowered a notch, that the waves cresting now were a little less steep, their blows less punishing. By what should have been late afternoon, though the sun was unseen, the gale was definitively easing. The crew peeked up from their hunkered stances to sniff the change like wary animals. Could it be trusted? Or was it a temporary pause before worse? Eric carefully stood to stretch his cramped legs, holding a stay for balance. He scanned the horizon a full circle. The sky was still a brooding mass of grey, but there was a marginal lightness to the west. The snow had stopped, and only drizzle remained. It loosens its grip, he rasped, voice nearly gone. Sven nodded, straightening. Aye, Thor has spent his rage for now. A few men smiled at that notion. Perhaps Thor in the heavens had been venting his battle fury with lightning and thunder elsewhere. Indeed, distant rumbles had been heard during the worst of it. And now, as often in myth, once Thor's hammer had quelled the threat, calm would return. Cautiously, they reassessed the situation. Everyone was alive, astonishingly, bruised, half frozen, but alive. Have-Brave herself had held. Together, the ship had not sprung any major leak, nor lost any vital piece. The mast was still firmly stepped. The sail, though furled, was intact. A few shields that had been tied along the gunwales, for custom and some protection, had been torn off by waves. Bits of one hung by its strap, clattering gently now. Some oars were cracked or lost, but spares were stowed under the decking planks. All things considered, they had weathered the storm better than many might. It was then that those with keen eyes noticed the blood. In the scuppers near the bow, diluted red swirled with the seawater. Immediately the cry went up. Who is hurt? They checked each other, lifting cloaks, looking for wounds. To their astonishment, none seemed injured enough to bleed that much. Then Leif remembered. During the ritual sacrifice before departure, they had brought some sacrificial blood, aboard in a wooden bowl, intending to perhaps anoint the bow for luck. In the chaos, that bowl had smashed, and its contents washed about. The sight of it now, though, shook them, as if the ship itself had bled. Some took it as a sign that their offering had indeed been accepted by the sea. Others shivered, thinking it an omen of blood yet to be spilled. Eric decided to turn it into a positive symbol. He dipped his fingers in the red-tinted water and marked a rune on the mast, the rune Algiz, shaped like a protective elk's silhouette. "We are marked for protection," he declared loudly, trying to inject confidence. "The blood of our sacrifice binds us. We live, and the sea has spared us this day." The men murmured agreement, clinging to the thought. They had survived what would surely be one of the worst days of the journey, maybe of their lives. If they could survive that, perhaps they could survive whatever else winter had to throw at them. Gradually, as the hours wore on, the sea settled further. By nightfall, the gale had diminished to a chilly breeze. The waves were still significant, an after-swell rolling, but manageable. Under the overcast night sky, they couldn't see stars to navigate, so Eric chose to maintain a minimal sail and drift with a bit of control until daylight. They were likely blown off course anyway. Better to wait for the heavens to reveal their guide points again. The crew, utterly spent, welcomed a quiet night. They set extra watches in case the weather turned again or any unseen peril approached in the dark. But in truth, each man was at the edge of exhaustion. They tied the tiller to hold a steady angle and let the ship ride. Then one by one they curled up wherever they could find a space. Some too, tired even to eat. Wet, cold, and battered as they were, sleep came quickly from sheer fatigue. Leif, teeth still chattering uncontrollably, nonetheless drifted off the moment he shut his eyes, his body shutting down non-essential thoughts to focus on recovery. In his sleep, images of towering waves turned to giant creatures in his dreams, and he dreamt he was a child again, listening to a story by the hearth, safe in his father's lap, while a storm raged harmlessly outside. A few remained awake a while longer. Arnor the fisherman sat at the stern, humming softly and watching the dark water. In the distance he thought he saw a glimmer, perhaps bioluminescent plankton stirred by the ship's passage, or the reflection of something celestial through a crack in the clouds. It made him think of Aegir's daughters, the wave maidens of lore. He imagined them as tall, pale women, with hair of sea foam, dancing alongside their boat, sometimes helping to lift it over swells, other times trying to tug it down. "Not tonight," he whispered to the unseen sea spirits. "Tonight we earned our passage." At length, even Arnor slept, and only the appointed watchman stayed. Alert, if bleary, the storm had left a hush in its wake. It was not true silence. The sea never truly falls silent, but compared to the earlier chaos, the gentle slosh of water against the hull and the moan of the residual breeze were as soft as a lullaby. Havbrave drifted under the brooding winter night, a tiny speck of life in a vast solitude of sea. The men shivered in their fitful rest, but a core of warmth glowed in each, the triumph of having survived the bitter wind's onslaught. They did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for this night at least, they had earned a respite. Thus ended the day of the bitter wind, the first true test, passed. Yet winter was only beginning, and the northern seas had many more trials in store for them. As the Vikings slept, their longship gently carried onward, further into the unknown, under heavy skies that held both peril and wonder, yet unrevealed. The salt-frozen beard. Dawn arrived with a cold, pale light. The storm clouds had at last begun to break apart, leaving gaps through which dawn's glow filtered in wanly. The wind had shifted to the north and carried a knife-edge cold that cut deeper than before. Every exposed surface of the Longship shimmered with a thin crust of ice. Ropes were stiff, the sail edges crackled where spray had frozen on cloth, and a fringe of icicles hung along the gunwale where waves had splashed and solidified in the frigid night. The Viking crew awoke slowly, groaning as stiff limbs protested movement. Leif pushed himself upright from where he had been curled under a damp fur. As he did, something tugged painfully at his chin. His beard, a sparse, youthful beard, just beginning to grow in, was frozen to his cloak. The salt water that had drenched him, combined with his breath, had turned his beard into a stiff tangle of ice. Each hair encased in salt crystal frost, it stuck to the wool fibers of his cloak. He had to chip it free carefully with his fingers, which were clumsy and numb. Around him, other men were doing the same, peeling apart garments that had frozen together, cracking ice off their boots and belts. It was a strange sight, each man adorned with a salt-frozen beard, faces rimed white as if aged overnight, brows and lashes frosted. They looked like a crew of winter spirits or revenants, rather than living sailors. A few made wry jokes through chattering teeth. "Ha, see, here, Hakon's grown a glacier on his chin," one said, gesturing to a comrade whose thick brown beard was now more ice than hair. Hakon responded by striking a pose, pretending to comb the icicles as if they were a proud king's braids. The men laughed quietly. In such brutal conditions, humor, however small, was a lifeline. It reminded them they were still human, still alive, not merely elements in a frozen tableau. But beneath the forced mirth lay the sobering reality. The cold was relentless and would only worsen as winter deepened. They had survived the storm's violence, but now they faced a quieter foe, the creeping, insidious freeze that could sap life away in slow, numbing increments. Each man knew that frostbite could blacken a careless toe or finger, that hypothermia could lull a man into a sleep from which he wouldn't wake. They had to remain vigilant in motion and spirit to keep the cold at bay. They resumed their duties that morning with sluggish determination. The sea around them was now moderate. A swell remained, but the waves were an unruly child compared to yesterday's giant. Low hills of water, dark blue and flecked with foam, rolled under the keel. The sky above was a patchwork of steel-grey clouds and a few pale blue windows. From one of those breaks in the clouds, a feeble sun ray touched the water, and Arnor crossed himself, a gesture he'd picked up in Christian lands, though he still held to the Norse gods. Many Vikings did a bit of both. Others simply raised their faces to the light, eyes closed, letting even that weak warmth caress their raw cheeks. Eric took stock of their position as best he could. The storm had driven them southward, that much he guessed, by the unfamiliar wave patterns and some kelp that, drifted by the kind of seaweed he expected further south in the North Sea. When the sun peaked enough, he used the sunstone for a quick orientation, holding the translucent calcite crystal up to the brightest part of the overcast. He rotated it until a distinct double refraction pattern aligned, indicating the sun's hidden position. Satisfied, he nodded and gave the order to adjust their course slightly. They would row and sail as winds allowed, aiming to regain a more northerly line toward the islands or coast they sought. With a relatively calm day ahead, attention turned to personal recovery and the daily routine aboard. A few of the crew were assigned to inspect the ship for any damage. They found a cracked strake, hull plank, near the bow where the worst wave had hit. It was not yet leaking, but they reinforced it with a wooden splint and tarred cloth from the inside as a precaution. Several oars were replaced with spares. One crewman, Asmund, had injured his shoulder during the storm, possibly wrenched by an oar or when he was thrown against a bulkhead. He winced as he moved it. The resident healer of the group, an older man named Thorar, made Asmund sit while he applied a poultice of dried herbs and warm water heated from their small iron brazier. A risky thing to light, but in calm weather they could carefully kindle a little fire atop a shield filled with sand to contain it, just enough to warm water or dry gloves. This brazier fire was a treasure now. They lit it amidships, shielding the flame from wind with their bodies. The heat was meager, but the men crowded their hands around, sighing as feeling slowly returned to fingers. Steam rose as they held up bits of clothing or foot wraps to dry. The smell of smoke, normally so commonplace in daily life on land, smelled of comfort here, a whiff of hearth and home in the sterile salt chill. Thorar used the heat to warm some broth, made by dissolving bits of dried meat and bone in hot water from a barrel. He passed wooden cups around. It was a thin, oily broth, but heavenly to those sipping it. The warmth traveled down into cold bellies and radiated outward, lifting spirits momentarily. One by one, the men attended to their salt-frozen beards. They cracked off chunks of ice and combed through with fingers to remove the salt that encrusted everything. Salt was valuable, but here it had become an irritant. It chafed skin and made any small cuts sting fiercely. Some jokingly sucked on the icy chunks like candy to get a bit of salt back in their system. Others just tossed them overboard. When at last their faces were free of the icy tangles, many left their beards damp but open to the air, hoping the weak sun and breeze would dry them before the next freeze. They looked younger without the hoary frost, a reminder that they were not truly ancient spirits, but men in their primes, determined to live beyond this voyage. As the day progressed, the cold remained intense but manageable through constant activity. The crew took turns rowing, not solely to move the ship, but to keep their blood circulating. Rowing shifts had the side benefit of warming the body. After a quarter hour of hard pulling, a man might even break a day, sweat despite the chill. They rotated frequently to avoid exhausting anyone completely. Meanwhile, others busied themselves with chores, recoiling wet ropes, scraping ice off surfaces, mending a few torn pieces of clothing. Busy hands staved off numbness, and busy minds staved off despair. The layout of the Longship became both boon and bane in the cold. Its open nature meant nothing prevented the wind from knifing through, or waves from coming in, a clear disadvantage compared to later ships with decks and cabins. However, being open also meant that when the sun did shine, or when they lit a small fire, the radiant warmth spread easily without obstruction, and though they were exposed to the cold air, they were not trapped in damp, unventilated enclosures that could bring illness quickly. As one man quipped from under layers of wool, "At least here the wind takes away the smell of wet socks, unlike in those cursed enclosed nars." He referred to the trading nar ships, which had small holds. Indeed, those holds could become foul with odors and bad air on long voyages, though they provided more shelter. They all recollected the wisdom of staying warm that Viking seafarers adhered to. They wore layers of wool because it stayed insulating even when wet. They had brought spare cloaks and blankets sealed in waxed leather sacks to keep them dry. These now came out to wrap around shoulders while off duty. They also kept their heads covered. A good wool cap or hood was essential to conserve body heat. It was said among them that the north wind will steal your scalp's warmth first, so most had woolen hats pulled low or fur-lined hoods drawn up whenever not in strenuous labor. Conversation on deck drifted to how other sailors endured such cold. A few had sailed south before and scoffed, "Those Mediterranean traders, they'd die in a day here." Another remarked, "Even the whales go to warmer waters now. Only us fools remain." There was truth in that. By winter, many sea creatures migrated or went to deep water. Food would be scarcer to catch. As a result, a worrying thought left unvoiced just now. Despite fatigue, some men grew restless after the storm's enforced hunkering. Bjarni, ever the energetic soul, began doing quick exercises, squats and arm swings, on the middeck to limber up. "Can't let these old bones freeze solid," he grinned. Soon a couple of others joined in his antics, turning it into a mock training routine, as if back at their village green. They thrust spears at invisible foes, jumped and landed to mimic dodging blows, all in good fun. The absurdity of doing combat drills on an icy ship in the middle of the ocean brought about chuckles, but it served its purpose. Blood flowed, spirits lifted, camaraderie was reinforced in these light moments. As noon approached, the sky unexpectedly cleared to a pale winter blue. The sun, though low on the southern horizon, even at its zenith, for they were far north, and it was midwinter, shone unobstructed for a short while. The effect on morale was profound. The crew tilted their faces up, eyes closed, basking in what little warmth they could absorb. They resembled a row of sun-starved sailors worshipping the daylight. In those few minutes, one could almost imagine being home on a crisp winter morning, rather than adrift at sea. The sunlight brought thoughts of snow-covered fields, and smoke rising from cottage chimneys. Leif felt tears prick in his eyes as he thought of home in that sunshine. He pictured his family's farm, the way the frost glittered on the barn roof, the smell of his mother's stew wafting in the air when he came in from chopping wood. It was only a moment's reverie, but it fueled his resolve. He would see home again. He would endure all this and carry the tale back to his kin, wiping his eyes and pretending it was only the bright light causing tears. He got back to work with renewed vigor. In this rare fair weather window, Eric convened a quick council with Svend and a few senior men. They spread a hide map on the deck, carefully held down at the corners by axes, and knives to prevent wind from snatching it away. The map was rudimentary, depicting coastlines and islands with runic labels. They identified their likely position after the storm's drift. It seemed they had been pushed south of the main route. Possibly they were nearer to the Hebrides, or even north of mainland Scotland now, rather than the intended Faroe or Shetland direction. If so, they had to decide: attempt to reach a closer shore to regroup, or labour back northwards against winter winds to resume the planned route. The debate was short. Given their state and the season, aiming for the nearest land made sense. Any landfall to repair, resupply water, and rest would be a boon. Eric traced a finger on the hide. If we go south by west, we may strike the Orkney Jar or mainland coast. Those were islands under Viking control, where they might find shelter. The risk was they could miss them and overshoot into the open North Atlantic. But their navigator instincts told them they were in the North Sea still, east of those islands. There was also talk of possibly encountering Irish or Scottish coastal settlements, some friendly, some not. But desperation for safety trumped those worries. They resolved to adjust course accordingly. As the sun slipped behind clouds again, the men returned to their tasks. Oars were manned now, not just for exercise, but to push forward. With winds light and variable after the storm, rowing was necessary. The rowers grunted in unison, the oarlocks creaking with each stroke. Those not on oars performed other upkeep. The brazier fire was carefully extinguished once enough had been warmed. They could not risk an ember catching the ship's wood, and already a stray spark had put a tiny scorch on a beam, quickly slapped out. Now that the adrenaline of the storm had faded, the crew began feeling the deeper aches and pains of their journey. Shoulders were strained from rowing and holding on during the gale. Backs were sore from cold sleep on hard planks, and many bore minor injuries, bruises, scrapes, and some bloodied blisters on hands. They tended these as well as possible. Thora handed out a few rags soaked in brine for cleansing wounds. Ironically, salt water, the very thing biting them, was also a cleanser to stave off infection in cuts. Some chewed on willow bark from their medicine bag to dull pain, knowing, perhaps not the science, but the tradition, that it helped relieve aches. One of the more concerning ailments was frostbite's early signs. A rower named Kolbein revealed that he couldn't feel two of his toes since the night. He pulled off his boot with effort. It had partly frozen stiff. His toes were white and leathery to the touch. Thorar frowned and immediately took action. He warmed water to a tepid temperature. Not hot. They knew rapid heat on a frozen limb could be damaging, and had Kolbein dip his feet. Gently, the blood flow returned, and with it, excruciating pins and needles that made the burly warrior groan like a child. But pain was good. It meant life in the flesh. Thorar also checked everyone's fingers and noses. Any pale or waxy-looking skin was briskly rubbed and warmed before frostbite could set in deeply. They all learned from Kolbein's scare and made a point to wiggle toes and fingers, often, even while rowing, to keep circulation. It was paradoxical, dealing with the cold. Water, their enemy in excess, was also a friend in controlled measure for warming frostbit parts or hydrating them. Fire, a friend for heat. Could boar fire be a lethal foe if it caused a blaze on their wooden craft? In this environment, everything was a balance of careful measure. They navigated these contradictions daily, guided by the hard-won wisdom of generations of Norse seafarers, passed down by word of mouth. As evening approached, the clear spell passed, and a gentle snow began to fall again. Unlike the stinging sleet of the storm, this was a benign snowfall, big, lazy flakes drifting down around them, kissing their faces with chill. The wind was mild. Some of the younger ones stuck out their tongues to catch the flakes for sport, prompting rare, genuine laughter from the older men who chided them as children. But even the elders smiled as the snow dusted their hair. In its quiet way, the falling snow seemed to muffle the world, bringing a sense of peace after the late turmoil. The Longship sailed on, now with a combination of light wind in their rehoisted sail and steady rowing. Their beards, while no longer ice-encrusted, were stiff with salt and now collecting snow, turning the men into white statues again, albeit of a softer mien. They truly looked like carles of winter, hearty and stubborn. As darkness fell, the brief daylight of winter done, they prepared for another frigid night. They had an advantage now. Some of their clothing was drier from the day's sun and brazier, and they pre-warmed themselves with a short burst of rowing right before settling to sleep, so their bodies generated heat. This night, they also had a little warm meal, small as it was, which Thora concocted by mixing crushed dried peas into the meaty broth, making a kind of thin gruel. It was hot and full of fat from the meat, which helped keep them warm through the night. Each man savoured his portion, though it would scarcely count as a meal by normal standards. They maintained their duty of night watches religiously. 3 men stayed up at any given time through the darkness, rotating every couple of hours. The watchers stomped their feet and swung their arms, often to stay warm and awake. They scanned the horizons for any sign of lights, from land or other ships, and watched the sky for changes. But the snow clouds obscured much. It was an inky, starless night. The only illumination came from the dull reflection of the blanketed sea. The water had a subtle glow, not from any light above, but from a froth of phosphorescent plankton that occasionally sparked when the ship cut through a wave. Tiny green-blue flickers dashed alongside the hull, like the trailing lights of some ghostly fish. One watchman whispered to another that these were Rand's watery spirits guiding them, but his friend replied it was just sea fire, known to any sailor on dark nights, and a good sign, meaning lively waters, likely with fish. The men's beards froze again overnight, though less dramatically, as they were more sheltered without a storm's spray. By morning of the next day, each had again a stiff mask of frost around his mouth from breathing. It became a familiar ritual to break the ice off and laugh at each other's frosty visages. It was now day 4 since they'd left their home shores, and the routine of hardship had ingrained itself. The Vikings had the uncanny ability to normalize even the direst conditions, to make a kind of rough home out of misery. Already inside jokes were forming about their predicament. One man, whose nose always seemed to gather the most icicles, was nicknamed Snornef, Snow Nose, and he leaned into it, announcing each morning, "A new crop of jewels on my nose. Boys, I'll be a rich man when we get home." Another, whose beard froze into two prongs that looked like a goat's horns, was teased as Troll Breath for looking like a frost troll. By finding humor and giving names to these facets of their suffering, they took a measure of power over it. Each chuckle was a small victory against despair. The cultural spirit among the crew also played a part in enduring these trials. These were Norsemen, raised on sagas of heroes who faced far worse and still triumphed. Around a figurative hearth, the memory of one, at least, they carried the encouragement of ancestors and gods. Some men quietly recited the Havamal verses they knew, ancient wisdom sayings, to fortify their minds. Cattle die, kinsmen die. One day you yourself shall die. I know one thing that never dies, the honor of the complete, true hero, one muttered to himself from Odin's words of wisdom. Here on the indifferent sea, where death felt closer than ever, such maxims spurred them to live in a way that if they did perish, they would do so with bravery and honor, not cowardice. With each other's support, thorough, practical measures, and a hearty dose of Viking grit, the crew pushed on through a second day of severe cold and exhausting labor. Their salt-crusted beards and hair became emblems of pride, proof of what they had endured. By the time another sunset bled pale orange across the southwestern horizon, only briefly before vanishing, the men were exhausted but more confident. They had fallen into the rhythm of survival. However, they all knew this was just the beginning. Winter at sea would test them again and again. Storms might return, hunger could gnaw, sickness could creep in. But, having survived both a gale and the numbing freeze so far, each man harbored a cautious hope, like a tiny ember glowing deep within. They tended those embers in their hearts, shielding them from the winds of fear, as jealously as they did the little brazier's coals. On the second night, after the storm, as they drifted under a clearing sky, an amazing spectacle unfurled above. The northern lights began to dance, faintly at first, then in shimmering curtains of green. The weary crew took notice in awe, their frosty beards tilted up to the heavens. The next chapter of their story was about to be written under those mystical lights, with oaths and resolve forged anew against the winter's long night. Beneath the endless night, the farther north one sails in winter, the shorter the days become, until day is barely a memory, and night stretches seemingly without end. As Havbrave continued its voyage, the crew entered a realm of long darkness. It was a world where the sun skimmed the horizon for only a scarce few hours at midday, leaving dawn and dusk to linger and blend into each other. In this perpetual twilight, the Viking sailors faced a new kind of trial, the psychological weight of endless night, and the eerie quiet it often brought. On a moonless evening, the Longship cut through inky waters under a sky, pricked by countless stars. Tonight, at least, the clouds had dispersed, granting a full view of the celestial dome. The sea had settled to a gentle roll. A hush fell over the crew. After the cacophony of storm and the strenuous work of the past days, this calm felt almost alien. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft lap of water on wood and the occasional creak of the rudder. Many of the men lay awake longer than usual, gazing upward, with no light pollution or cover. The stars were brilliant and near. The Milky Way unfurled as a shimmering river of white across the sky. It was as though they sailed not on the ocean alone, but through the very night sky itself, black below and black above, with stars reflected in the gentle swells around them. At first, the darkness was a relief, a time to recover in stillness. But as hours dragged on, it began to weigh on minds. In the dark, one's thoughts can turn inward sharply. Memories of home, fears for the future, the vastness of isolation, these rose up in men's minds. For some, it became overwhelming. Young Leif, unable to sleep, found himself trembling not from cold, but from a surge of homesickness and uncertainty. Under his fur cloak, tears filled his eyes unbidden. He had been so outwardly brave among the others, but here in the dark his youth showed. He missed his mother's lullabies, his father's steady presence. He missed the very sound of a crackling hearth, the smell of warm bread. What if he never felt those things again? Leif's breath hitched, and he quietly began to cry. The sound was swallowed by the vast night, or so he thought. Not far from Leif, old Styr lay on his back, chewing thoughtfully on a straw he had tucked away. Despite age, Styr often kept a light watch on his younger shipmates, even when off duty. He heard the soft sniffles. Rolling over, he placed a comforting hand on Leif's blanketed shoulder. "Dark thoughts come with the dark, lad," he whispered in a low, reassuring tone. "It's the way of night. Makes mice of the bravest of nose. Us." Leif quickly tried to stifle his sobbing, embarrassed, but Styr continued gently. "No shame. I too think of my home. My grandchildren must be playing in the snow about now. I pray I'll see them come spring." Leif wiped his eyes in the darkness. Hearing the old warrior speak of longing somehow made him feel less alone. "How do you endure it?" he whispered back. Styr shifted to sit upright, the outline of his figure barely visible. "By remembering that the night is not endless. Even here, even now, it only feels so. The sun will return, little by little. We'll double, chase it, and it will meet us halfway." He paused, then added, "And by telling myself stories. Would you hear one?" Leif sniffed and nodded, grateful. And so Styr began to tell a tale softly into the night. Others nearby, awake and silent with their thoughts, turned ears toward the familiar comfort of a story. He chose the tale of Frithiof and the bear, a lesser-known saga snippet about a lost hunter in a winter forest who befriends a great bear that guides him home. Styr's deep voice wove the imagery, the dark pines, the glowing eyes of the bear in the firelight, the hunter's fear turning to trust. As he spoke, the crew listened, each picturing the scenes in their mind's eye. The story's gentle rhythm was as hypnotic as the rocking of the ship. Some chuckled quietly when the bear stole fish from the hunter's pack, or sighed when the bear warded off wolves in the pack. Night to protect the sleeping man. It was a calm, friendly tale, just what was needed. By the time Styr concluded with the hunter waking at dawn at the edge of his village, the bear gone as mysteriously as it came, implied to be Odin in disguise, testing kindness. A few of the men were quietly snoring. The tension in Leif's chest had eased. He felt drowsy at last, focused on that heartwarming imagery rather than his fears. "Thank you," he murmured to Styr, who patted his shoulder again. "Rest now, son. We've many miles yet." In the lore-rich culture of the Norse, a story was as good as a blanket against the chill of despair, and this night proved it so. Yet, the long hours of night watches remained. Those on duty fought the natural urge to nod off. One trick they used was quietly singing verses or reciting genealogy. listing their forefathers' names and deeds, a sort of oral lineage exercise. This not only kept the mind alert, but it reminded them of who they were and where they came from. It anchored them. Svend, while scanning the horizon for any sign of shore, murmured his ancestry under his breath. Svend, son of Horolf, son of Dag, who slew the bear at Ulfsholm. Dag, son of Vidar, who farmed the valley by the great oak. Vidar, son of Sten, who came across the whale road from Gotland, and so on. Each name was like a bead on a string, carrying memory and identity. In this endless night, those memories burned like small torches in his mind, keeping him oriented in more ways than one. Stars also guided them. When the wind was steady, Eric would sometimes steer by star sight, aligning the ship with a constellation known to rise or set at certain times. They all knew the North Star, Polaris, well. It hung low but bright in the press, sky to the north, a steadfast beacon that practically shouted, "Home lies here," toward their Scandinavian latitudes. Sailing west or south was trickier by stars, but they had their methods. They watched the Big Dipper's rotation around the North Star as a crude clock, or tracked Orion and the Partick Pleiades when visible, as those signified winter timing. There was lore that a certain star named Lydas Jana, the guiding star, likely Polaris, was used by Viking navigators to hold their course at night. Indeed, Eric did so now. He tried to keep that star at a consistent bearing relative to the mast, a rough check that they weren't veering off hopelessly while they drifted more than sailed in gentle winds. It was during one such night, under a canopy of stars, that a subtle green glow began to ripple in the far sky. At first, it was mistaken for a low cloud catching starlight, but it grew, unfurling like a phantom banner. The watchman nudged his companion, eyes wide. "Look yonder, the sky fires." They all became alert as the aurora borealis, the northern lights, intensified. Curtains of ethereal light pulsed and waved from the northern horizon across the zenith. Green was dominant, but tinges of purple and white shimmered at the edges. It was as if the night itself had begun to dance. The snow-covered deck glowed faintly green under this celestial illumination. Men awoke, one by one, to the excited murmurs of their crewmates. Soon, the entire company was awake, sitting or standing in awe. To the Vikings, this was more than a light show. It was a potent omen and wonder. Many believed these lights were reflections of Valkyrie's armor, the shield maidens of Odin riding across the sky. In their mythos, such a sight meant Odin's hand was moving, collecting the souls of brave warriors to Valhalla. Normally, it was said to be cause for celebration, a sign of honor if one were to die soon, chosen by Odin's own. But here, at sea in peril, the interpretation could be double-edged. Did it mean one of them was fated to die in battle or storm and be chosen? Or was it a blessing of protection from Allfather to his children struggling against the odds? The men regarded the aurora with mixed reverence and trepidation. Some, like Bjarni and Hakon, were elated. They whooped softly, raising hands to the sky. "Wahi, Valkyrjur, we see you. Carry our deeds to Odin." Their eyes sparkled in the otherworldly glow, fierce pride swelling, as if certain now that whatever happened, they would be remembered. Others, like Arnor, felt a chill of superstition. Arnor knelt, head bowed, silently saying a prayer, to not be taken yet. "Not this night. Kind Valkyries, I beg you, Let me fight a battle worth your gaze, not merely the sea. Eric realized this spectacle could deeply affect morale. It needed framing in a positive light. So he gathered the men on the middeck, all faces upturned to the swirling heavens. In a strong voice, made strong by conviction more than volume, he addressed them. Brothers, see how the sky itself dances for us this night. The tales say these lights are the Valkyries' glow. Yes, their armor catching the light as they ride. If that be true, then I say, the Valkyries themselves honor our struggle. He turned slowly, making eye contact with many. We have battled storms and darkness. Perhaps Odin has taken note, but hear me. We are not on a battlefield of men, and we are not dying this night. The All-Father sent his shield maidens to hearten us, to let us know we fight a worthy fight against the sea. Svend picked up on Eric's intent and added in a booming tone, "Aye, no coward could behold such sights. Only hardy warriors at sea, doing what few dare, earn this sky fire as guide." Another chimed in, raising his hands. "Thank you, Odin, for lighting our path." It became a sort of impromptu ceremony. The crew, inspired, stood or knelt and raised their voices in a solemn oath-taking beneath the aurora. Each man spoke according to his heart, making short oaths or prayers aloud, something rarely done in such unison. One swore, "If I live to see land, I'll sacrifice a golden arm ring at Thor's temple for this deliverance." Another vowed, "I'll tell my children and my children's children of this voyage, so none forget our daring." Leif, eyes shining and face tinted green by the lights, placed a hand over his chest and pledged quietly, "I will not falter, whatever comes. I will make my father proud." These individual promises wove together like strands of rope, strengthening the bond among all present. The chapter aptly called Oaths Under the Northern Lights was being written on their souls right then and there. Under the swirling emerald sky, they felt a rare unity of purpose and spirit that transcended their individual fears. It was as if they stood in a great mead hall of the gods, each making a toast of intent, with the Valkyries themselves listening. Unbeknownst to them, these acts likely served to anchor their sanity too. The endless night can breed hopelessness and hallucinations, but by channeling the mystery of the night into structured meaning, myth, ritual, oath, they reclaimed power over the unknown. Instead of fearing the lights as a mere portent of doom, they incorporated it into their journey's narrative positively. After the oath-taking, a calm fell. The aurora still churned in silent majesty, but the men's hearts were now steady. Eric then suggested something bold yet fitting. "We shall give an offering now, to seal our oaths and seek favor." The sea was calm enough for a brief ritual. He retrieved a small horn of mead, one of the few luxuries they had saved for emergencies, and a dried loaf of bread. Placing these on the prow, he offered them to the night sky and sea. In clear Old Norse, he invoked Odin, Alfurther, and you, Valkyrja, above. Take this drink as thanks for noticing us. Thor Donna, take this bread as token of our toil. Njord, Aegir, Ran, all powers of wind and wave, know that we respect your realms. Guide us if you deem us worthy. Test us if you must. We are here, unyielding. With that, he poured a splash of mead into the sea and set the rest adrift in the horn, and crumbled the bread into pieces, casting it overboard as well. The crew murmured assent and bowed heads. Oddly, after that offering, A gentle breeze arose from the east, behind them, filling their sail, just slightly. The helmsman noticed and whispered to Eric with astonishment. It could be coincidence, or perhaps a normal shift in weather, but at that moment, the men entertained the hopeful notion that their offering was accepted. A fair wind at last, someone smiled. They trimmed the sail and used the oars lightly, gliding forward beneath the still glowing sky. Throughout the long night, the aurora borealis continued its dance. It shifted from green to faint red and back to green, eventually fading in intensity as the hours waned. But by then, most of the crew had found rest. The emotional catharsis of the oaths and the mesmerizing spectacle left them strangely refreshed. Many slept deeply, swaddled in furs, dreams calmer than previous nights. Even those on watch felt less alone, as if friendly eyes watched over them from above. One watchman, gazing at the residual aurora, felt bold enough to break the silence with a soft tune, a lullaby his mother used to sing about the goddess Freya, riding in her cat-drawn chariot under northern lights. It was barely audible, a humming more than lyrics, but its sweetness layered on the night's tranquility. Thus, beneath the endless night, the Viking crew found a way not just to survive, but to claim a measure of peace and meaning. In the heart of darkness, they discovered fellowship and resolve. Lit by the heavens, the endless night would continue its rotation, but it no longer felt so endless or empty. It had been filled with their voices, their promises, their faith in one another. And so, when the first hint of dawn, more a lessening of darkness than any brightening, crept into the sky, they greeted it not with desperation, but with quiet confidence. They had passed another test of the winter sea, the test of morale and spirit in the face of unbroken night. Oaths under the northern lights. The sky was alive with ghostly green light, ribbons of aurora borealis unfurling across the darkness. Under that shimmering vault, the Viking crew gathered on the deck of their longship, faces uplifted in awe. The northern lights danced and pulsed, illuminating the sea in an eerie emerald glow. To these Norsemen, the aurora was no mere curiosity of nature. It was an omen charged with meaning. Many believed it the reflection of Valkyrie's armor as they galloped through the sky, a sign that Odin's warrior maidens rode out to choose the worthy. Others whispered older tales of spirits and old gods painting the heavens. But on this night, beneath the vast Arctic night, the crew of Havbrav felt not fear, but a solemn wonder. They had endured bitter cold, brutal seas, endless dark. Now the cosmos itself seemed to acknowledge their struggle. The green swathes of light rippled, slowly, silently, casting moving shadows on the ship. Snowflakes glinted as they fell through the luminescence. Every man's breath hung in the air like silver mist, each exhale a quiet offering to the night. The longship drifted with sail half furled, as if nature, too, paused to watch the prose, celestial spectacle. Eric, at the center of the group, raised his hands. In that unearthly glow, his weathered face looked almost otherworldly, eyes catching the green reflection. "Hear me, men," he said, voice low but carrying in the expectant hush. "The gods are watching." It did not sound like a warning, but an affirmation. Each man, to a one straightened, squaring shoulders. They all sensed it. Something momentous in this moment. A chance to speak their hearts into the vast listening dark. One by one, they began to speak their oaths. It was not coordinated by any plan, but emerged organically, like sparks flaring one after another. The quiet lapping of waves and the crackle of distant ice were the only other sounds as these determined vows were spoken into the aurora-lit night. "I swear," called Bjarni, his broad silhouette outlined in green light, "that I'll see my farm again. Thor as witness, I'll embrace my wife come spring and tell her how my axe sang in the storm." He thumped his chest, and the resonance of his bold words gave courage to the others. "By Freya's tears, I will not falter," pledged Svend, usually a man of few words. He gripped the rail with a scarred hand. "If death comes in these waves, let it find me standing, not cowering. And if life is spared us, I'll hold a feast each year on this night to honor it." The crew murmured approval at that, envisioning a warm hall, a roaring fire, cups overflowing, with mead in remembrance of this very moment. Leif's turn came almost unwittingly. The youth stepped forward a pace, his face unlined and eyes shining. In a trembling yet resolved voice, he said, "I vow to make my father proud, to return with a tale he will tell around the hearth. And I vow, should any brother here fall, I will carry his memory home." There was a soft grunt of respect from an older warrior at that. It was a heavy promise for a young man, showing the depth of his loyalty. One of the helmsmen, who had been stoically silent for most of the journey, lifted his gaze to the lights and spoke as if to the sky. "Njord, Lord of Winds, you've tested us sorely. I give you this oath. The day my feet stand on land again, I will donate my best catch of herring to feed the poor in your name." A humble fisherman's offering, but heartfelt. It was how he knew to give thanks for survival by an act of generosity. The oaths continued, each man finding words for his fears and hopes, forging them into promises tangible and clear. Some were grand, promising temples and sacrifices. Others, simple, promising to live better lives or cherish loved ones more dearly if fate allowed them to reunite. In speaking these thoughts aloud, under those drapes of aurora fire, they gave up their inner burdens to something greater. The northern lights seemed to brighten at intervals, as if in response or applause. For a moment, they fell silent and simply listened. Above, the aurora's silent symphony carried on. It was strange. Though it made no sound, they all felt as if they could hear something. A distant ethereal chorus, a swelling of unseen Valkyrie song perhaps, or the crackle of Odin's fire. It was imagination. They knew, yet how real. It seemed in this charged atmosphere. Then Eric unsheathed his seeks, a short sword knife every Viking carried. In a swift motion he pricked his palm, a bead of blood welling. "I bind my oath in blood," he declared, "that I will lead true, and if I fail, let my own blood pay the price." Without hesitation, Bjarni and a few others did the same. Small cuts, red droplets in the snow at their feet. No one was grievously harming themselves. It was symbolic, a warrior's pledge. But the sight of bright blood under the green sky was striking. Red on white under green, colors of life and myth intertwined. They decided to consecrate those blood oaths with a shared ritual. From their stores, a drinking horn was brought out, containing a precious few swallows of mead saved for morale. They mixed in a bit of water to stretch it for all, and passed the horn around, each taking a small sip. As each man drank, he spoke a single word, "Till ours okay frither," meaning, for a good year and peace, the traditional toast for well-being. In the context of their journey, it meant survive this winter and find peace at the end of it. The horns circled, the last drops spilled over the side as a libation to the sea. At that moment, a shooting star streaked through the aurora, a bright, swift arrow of white across the green. Some cried out in surprise. A good omen, they decided, clapping each other on the back. In their culture, a falling star could mean a soul, traveling, or a sign from the gods. They chose to believe it heralded that their oaths had been heard and accepted. The effect of this gathering was profound. The men felt an overwhelming sense of unity and resolve. Where earlier fatigue and doubt had lurked, now a shared determination took root. They had spoken aloud the things most dear: love of family, hope of homecoming, desire for honor, and in so doing, they rekindled those as guiding lights in themselves. Each man now knew what his comrades yearned for, what they pledged, and it bound them tighter than any rope. There, in the freezing nowhere of the northern sea, they had formed a brotherhood in light and oath that could carry them through the dark. As if to bless this, the wind gently picked up, bellies of the sails stirring. The Longship, which had been near stationary in the calm, began to glide forward with purpose. Again, the breeze blew from the east, crisp and steady, the direction they needed to make way toward where they believed land lay. Sven took the tiller with a grin, feeling the guidance. "A good wind, at last," he murmured, echoing the sentiment that perhaps their skyborn witnesses were lending aid. They worked quietly then, with reverence, trimming the sail and adjusting course under the luminous sky. But their hearts were light. The biting cold seemed less cruel when faced with renewed spirit. Some men even swore they felt warm from within, a flush on their cheeks that the frost could quench. It was the warmth of hope. The aurora gradually shifted, the intense greens fading to a faint silver curtain as the night passed its deepest point. Yet, none would forget those hours. In their minds and in their sagas to be told later, this would stand out. The night they swore. Oaths under the northern lights. Many years later, grey-bearded survivors of Havbrave would recount with pride how the sky lit up like day, how they made pledges heard by gods and peers alike, and how from that night onward they knew no fear could break them. In the immediate hours after, though, what mattered most was that each man crawled back under his fur or took up his oar with a newfound calm. Hardship was ahead, yes, but their purposes had been reaffirmed. Leif slept, dreaming not of storms this time, but of a bright hall where green lights flickered in the rafters and warriors. Feasted, a curious melding of reality and dream, perhaps Valhalla glimpsed, or perhaps simply his mind cherishing the camaraderie of the night. Eric remained awake a while, watching the last aurora flares diminish. He pressed a hand to the carved dragon prow and quietly said thanks to the gods, and to his men, for he knew neither he nor this voyage could succeed without both divine favor and mortal loyalty. Above, the stars began to fade into the deep blue pre-dawn. Oaths under the northern lights were sealed in each heart. Whatever would come, be it more gales, gnawing hunger, or encounters with foes, they would meet it with the courage and solidarity born on this enchanted night. The sky's performance ended, but its effect lingered, like an afterglow inside their very souls. The gnawing hunger. With the passage of days, a new adversary emerged to test the crew's resolve. Hunger, the initial stores of food, carefully rationed, began to dwindle. The cold and hard work had sharpened every man's appetite, Yet they had to tighten their belts and minds against the persistent gnawing in their bellies. As the longship pressed onward under low grey skies, the men found themselves speaking more often of food almost involuntarily, their thoughts drifting to warm meals of the past and the gnawing desire for sustenance in the present. Each morning, they divided what remained of their provisions. It was a meagre allotment, perhaps a strip of dried fish or salt pork, a heel of hard bread softened in water, and a sip of ale or water. Early in the voyage, they could eat heartily, but after the storm and days of drifting, supplies had been soaked or lost, and much time had passed without resupply. Now every crumb was accounted for. They ate in silence, chewing slowly to extract every bit of flavor and trick their stomachs into feeling fuller than they were. By midday, stomachs rumbled anew. Men who normally boasted of going days without eating now found their tempers shortening as their gullets remained empty. Fatigue set in heavier. Movements grew slower, less from laziness and more from conservation of energy. Rowing became more labored and occasional. When winds allowed, they preferred to let the sail do the work to spare the crew's strength. The cold exacerbated hunger's bite. Without adequate food, their bodies struggled to stay warm. The human furnace needs fuel, and now fuel was scarce. Gums grew pale, and some men noted unusual fatigue and soreness beyond expected. Early whispers began about scorbugor, the dreaded scurvy, though they didn't know the scientific cause. Lack of vitamin C, unknown in their time. They recognized the signs. A couple of the older crewmen's gums were swollen and prone to bleeding when chewing the hard bread. One had a tooth loosen inexplicably. These were ominous signs for seamen, portending weakness that could worsen. To combat this, they turned to what the sea might provide. On calmer days, they fished. They rigged simple handlines with hooks fashioned from bent iron nails and baited them with bits of the very fish they had left or some mussels scraped off driftwood. Hours would pass with lines trailing behind the moving ship, or even while becalmed. Every tug or nibble sent a thrill of hope through the crew. They managed to catch a few small fish, codling or haddock, and once a larger cod that sparked a half cheer. But raw fish, while nourishing, was difficult to stomach cold in such weather. Nonetheless, they consumed it eagerly, some even crunching parts of the bones to extract marrow. One late afternoon, as light snow fell, Arnor felt a strong jerk on his line. He called softly for help, and two men carefully hauled the line, hand over hand. The water foamed, and out emerged a thrashing, glistening form, a silver Atlantic salmon, robust and plump, clearly far off its river course. It was a miracle fish. They dispatched it quickly and divided it. Eric insisted the first bites go to those showing the worst signs of illness, the ones with bleeding gums or who'd grown pale and listless. The fresh fish's flesh was rich and red. They sliced it thin and ate it raw like sashimi, letting the salty juices run down their chins. It was the best thing they'd tasted in weeks. Unbeknownst to them, that salmon likely carried some of the needed vitamins to stave off scurvy a bit longer. The men's mood lifted palpably after that catch. They offered a quick thanks to Ran, the sea goddess, for not taking all for herself and granting them a meal. Still, such strokes of luck were few. Other days, lines came up empty. Once, in desperation, they tried to catch a seabird, a lone gull that kept hovering around. Hakon tossed out some bits of fish gut, and when the gull swooped near the water, he hurled a net they'd improvised from rope. He nearly snagged it, but the bird flapped away with an angry cry. They cursed and laughed at the absurdity of trying to net a gull mid-air. Another time, they spotted a group of dolphins pacing the ship, their sleek bodies cresting playfully. Some saw it as a good omen. Dolphins often meant nearby land or calmer weather. Others wondered, with rumbling bellies, if they might spear one. But no one had the heart to try. Killing a creature known to help sailors felt taboo, and besides, landing a dolphin with their small spears would have been dangerous in the small craft. Hunger's toll grew more visible. Faces thinned, cheekbones standing out under wind-chapped skin. The sparking eyes dulled with each hungry day. Men began to conserve speech as well. Talking uses energy, after all, and sometimes it only reminded one of dryness in throat and emptiness below. In the long dark nights, they now dreamed vividly of food. Thorvald muttered in his sleep about roasted boar. Another smacked lips, as if tasting stew in his dreams. Upon waking to yet another portion of cold, hard tack and a few swallows of water, they felt a profound disillusionment that they had to shake off to keep despair away. One challenge was scurvy, though they didn't name it thus. The bleeding gums of two men worsened. One named Ov could barely chew his ration of bread. His gums were spongy and foul-smelling, blood dribbling at the slightest pressure. He kept mostly to water and the softer bits of fish they could spare for him. Another, Kolbein, the same who had frostbitten toes earlier, developed strange bruises on his legs and complained that old wounds ached terribly or seemed to reopen. The crew was alarmed. Some thought it a curse or some troll's work. In truth, the lack of fruits or greens and the monotony of dried foods was causing the classic signs of scurvy. But this was centuries before Lind or knowledge of vitamin C. Vikings normally mitigated scurvy by having shorter voyages or through foods like cloudberries, lichen, or fresh game whenever they landed. But trapped at sea, they were vulnerable. Thorar, the healer, did what he could with traditional remedies. He had a small pouch of cloudberry leaves and bark from a pine tree, both something he'd learned could help winter illness. He steeped these in hot water from melted snow to make a bitter tea and urged the afflicted to drink. It was disgustingly astringent, but perhaps the placebo or slight vitamin content did help. At the least, hydration was beneficial. He also distributed the last of the pickled cabbage they'd had, a precious jar from home, likely toted by one wise soul. The brine and fermented cabbage provided some crucial nutrients. He insisted, each man take a bite daily. This wasn't normal Viking ship fare, but sometimes trade goods like cabbage were aboard. Those tangy shreds might very well have been medicine in this context. Still, hunger gnawed. It became common to hear stomachs growling in quiet moments, a collective rumble that sometimes made them chuckle darkly. The sea serpent Jörmunganders found its way into my gut, one joked weakly, and it's twisting something fierce. To distract themselves, they told stories of feasts they'd enjoyed. This was a double-edged sword. Imagining lavish meals could either comfort or torment. But as one man said, if I cannot eat, at least let me remember eating. So they indulged in gastronomic storytelling. Bjarni recounted in loving detail the Jol feast last winter at his homestead. Whole pig roasted and dripping with fat, honey-glazed turnips, barley porridge with cream. He described how the skin crackled and how the mead kept flowing. Others chimed in with their favorite dishes: smoked reindeer haunch, trout baked in clay, rich stews of beef, and wild mushrooms. As they spoke, eyes half closed, they could almost taste it. Some, actually, salivated. They laughed at each other, wiping drool from beards. It was painful, but also perversely satisfying, a way to fill the void with memory, if not matter. Leif listened quietly, and then offered an imaginative twist. He began describing a dream banquet in Valhalla, adding mythic elements. He spoke of how in Odin's hall, the boar Sarimnir is cooked every night and reborn each day, providing endless meat for the Einherjar, fallen warriors. He described in poetic terms how a single boar could feed an army, how the mead flows from a magical goat, how in that dreamlike feast, no one ever goes hungry or thirsty. The crewmates smiled at the fancy. "We'll earn our seat at that table, lads," said Styr with a wink. "Though let's not be in too much hurry to die for it. We'll have a feast on Earth first." This talk of future feasting turned into a pact when they might thrive, survived, and returned home. They agreed to host a grand meal together at next Yuletide, inviting each other's families and slaughtering their best livestock to share. "We shall call it the Winter Sea Feast," Eric declared, "and none in our villages shall go hungry that night. In thanks that we lived." A hearty cheer followed, though it was thin from lack of energy. Still, the sentiment was sincere. This promise became a beacon pulling them forward, to survive, not only for survival's sake, but to fulfill that planned celebration of life. Despite these mental stratagems, the physical reality of hunger had to be continually addressed. They grew lightheaded at work. Sometimes standing up too fast would cause a man to wobble. They adjusted routines to prevent accidents, always working in pairs, especially on slippery tasks or near the ship's edge, lest a fainting spell send someone overboard. Fatigue meant more sleep was needed, yet ironically, hunger and cold made sleep fitful. Many nights, one or another would wake from a dream of food to the bitter reality of an empty stomach, and sleep would flee. They learned to take small sips of water when hunger pangs struck at night. It tricked the belly for a while into thinking it was full. Their fresh water was limited too, but luckily the winter climate provided snow and occasional rain, which they captured in skins or simply licked from the deck and sail. As days of scant rations turned to a week or more, the crew's physical strength waned. Tasks that were routine now required collective effort. Where one man could normally hoist the sail's yard, now two were needed. Rowing shifts had to be shorter, with more rest in between. They navigated slower, but safety was paramount. Pushing themselves to collapse would be worse. All the while, the world around grew more desolate in appearance. They sighted no birds for days at a time, a bad sign, since birds often mean land nearby or accessible food. The sea felt emptier, just endless waves and grey skies. This weighed on morale. It was as though nature herself had abandoned them to a wasteland of water. During this period, one man did succumb, not to death, but to a form of despairing lethargy. Ulf, whose scurvy was advanced, sank into a deep weakness. He lay under blankets, rarely moving, his eyes glassy. He ate only when coaxed, and sometimes not even then, letting precious bites fall from his lips. It was unclear if the deficiency, illness, or hopelessness, or a blend of both, had taken hold. They tried to rouse him with encouraging words. Styr even growled at him about the oath under the lights. "Don't you dare give up. Ulf, you swore to toast with us in that feast. Ulf would blink and nod faintly, but his will seemed to be slipping. One cold morning, they found Ulf colder than usual, a shallow breath the only sign he lived. Thorar warmed him and got some broth down his throat. That day, no aurora or stirring speech was at hand. It was a grim slog of worry. Eric realized they might lose Ulf if nothing changed. The pragmatic thought occurred that a dying man also threatened group survival, but he banished it. They would not throw over or abandon a comrade if there was any chance. By luck or fate, change did come. That afternoon, the lookout shouted, "Gull!" Far off, a white gull winged by, heading purposefully southeast. Everyone snapped to attention. Birds in mid-ocean often mean land in reachable distance. Gulls especially, since they roost on shore usually. Hearts quickened. They scanned the horizon, and, as if peeling a veil, the grey mist revealed a darker blur on the horizon. Land. It was distant, low, perhaps just an outcrop or island, but unmistakable. The men erupted in joy, or the closest thing to joy their weakened states could manage. Some laughed, some cried openly. The promise of solid ground, and whatever it held, fresh water, maybe game, edible plants, or just a break from endless motion, was nearly overwhelming. They joked about all the things they'd eat once ashore. "I'll chew grass like a cow if I have to." One grinned. "I'll eat the moss off the rocks. See if I don't." The thought of land spurred them to action like nothing else. From reserves of energy they didn't know remained, they rowed. They rowed with vigor, coordinating to maximize every stroke. The sail was trimmed to catch the slightest breeze, aiding that direction. All eyes were on that smudge of shore, gradually resolving into cliffs or maybe stony hills. As they drew closer by late afternoon, details emerged. Craggy black rocks with surf foaming at their bases, a slope of dun-coloured grasses above. It looked like a small, uninhabited island or skerry. No obvious smoke or buildings in sight. But to the crew, it was a slice of salvation. Where there's land, there might be birds' eggs, shellfish, maybe freshwater pools, maybe seal, or even small game. They made landfall at a pebbly cove just before dusk, the Longship scraping gently onto gravel. Several men jumped out into the frigid shallows without hesitation and pulled the ship in enough to secure it. The moment their boots touched ground, a cheer went up, weak but triumphant. Some collapsed to their knees and kissed the earth, tasting grit and salt, but not caring. Others staggered a few paces and just stood, relishing that solid steadiness after so long being tossed. The priority was food and water. Parties fanned out with what daylight remained. One group combed the shoreline. They found plenty of mussels and limpets clinging to rocks, plus some small crabs under stones. These were immediately collected. Another found a freshwater rivulet trickling down rocks. Not much, but clear and cold. They shouted with relief and began refilling their barrels and skins, drinking deeply but carefully, for too fast guzzling after thirst can make one ill. Steyr, Leaf, and a couple others climbed a bit inland to where tough grass and shrubs grew. Their noses led them to a wondrous find. A low shrub dotted with red-orange berries surviving even in the frost. Cloudberries. A small patch, but full of the vitamin C-rich fruit known to Nordic people. Half frozen but still tart sweet. Skirbuggers bane, Thorar exclaimed when they brought some back, immediately squeezing some juice onto Ulf's lips. and making a tonic for the sick from crushed berries. The men themselves devoured the rest. The sudden tang flooded their mouths and brought tears of gratitude to some. Another man speared a fat seabird that was nesting in a crevice, a cormorant or similar. They quickly plucked and cleaned it. With driftwood, they dared to make a small fire on shore, ensuring embers were contained, not to harm the boat. The smell of roasting bird and boiling mussels in seawater was perhaps the finest aroma any had known. They ate like ravenous wolves, but also carefully, knowing too much too fast could sicken a starving man. Still, the warm meat, albeit fishy and oily, was like ambrosia. They crunched even the soft bones. Mussels were slurped from shells, their briny taste relished. Some wild sorrel grass they found added a fresh tang. They even had a bit of hardtack left which they crumbled into the mussel broth, making a rudimentary stew. There on that bleak little island, under a sky turning purple with dusk, the crew held an impromptu Thanksgiving of sorts. Belly pains eased, strength trickled back, hope refilled. They laughed and burped and clapped each other's backs. Ulf managed to sit up and sip broth himself. A good sign. The men decided to stay the night ashore, in shifts with a couple, guarding the boat. The feel of not rocking to sleep was a luxury. They noted evidence that this island may have seasonal human use. An old fire ring of stones, a bit of rope, possibly by fishermen or monks or other seafarers. But none were there now. It was just as well. If it were inhabited, they might have been honor-bound to interact, trade, or for some among them of raider bent, perhaps plunder. But they were in no shape for conflict, and in their current grateful state, they would likely have been peaceful, regardless. Before turning in, Eric had them gather leftover shells and bones, and offer them to the sea in a small ceremony. This was to thank Aegir and Ran for the gifts of the sea that fed them, and Njord for guiding them to land. They also saved some cloudberries and left them on a flat rock as an offering to the land spirits of this isle. These acts, however simple, felt important, acknowledging their reliance on the natural world's mercy. The next morning, spirits were rejuvenated. They had a breakfast of remaining mussels and berries and refilled water again. Ulf was able to stand with help. His gums had stopped bleeding, and he managed a smile. It was time to depart. They dared not linger too long, not knowing where exactly they were, or if winter storms might trap them there. But now, the gnawing hunger had been tamed, at least for the time being. They had a renewed shot at continuing their voyage with strength. As Havbrave pushed off from the gravel beach, the men waved farewell to the little isle that had saved their lives. They named it in jest Fagnathari, Joy Island, for the joy of finding sustenance there. Steering back into the open sea, they felt almost reborn. The gnawing in their bellies was replaced by a warm fullness and newfound determination. They knew hunger could return, but having overcome it once, they believed they could again. The journey would continue, with more hardships no doubt, but the spectre of starvation had loosened its grip. The men hummed work songs again as they rowed away, their voices stronger than before. On the horizon ahead, clouds loomed, perhaps another storm, but they faced it with steadier hands and fuller hearts. The gnawing hunger had tested them sorely. In overcoming it, they took another step toward proving that indeed they could survive a Viking winter at sea. Offerings to Aegir. The winter sea had shown its wrath and its ruthlessness. Now, The crew of Havbrave sought to appease the powers that ruled the deep ocean. In Norse belief, the sea was not just water and waves. It was the domain of great beings. Aegir, the giant who personified the ocean's might and bounty, and his wife Ran, who with her net caught drowned sailors to dwell in her hall beneath the waves. The Vikings respected these entities, sometimes feared them, and certainly wished to win their favor. After surviving storms and near starvation, the men felt it was time to formally give thanks and seek mercy from the sea gods before venturing further. The sky was iron grey, the sea a dull silver, rolling under a biting wind. It was midday, and Eric judged by their maps and sightings, they still had far to go. Now was as good a time as any for a sacred moment. They prepared as best they could. On the open deck, an empty barrel was cleaned and turned on its side to serve as a makeshift altar. On it they placed items they could spare or deeply valued. A finely carved whalebone comb one man carried, a small silver coin another had sewn into his belt for luck, a few bronze arrowheads, one beautiful CX knife with a pattern-welded blade that a wealthier crew member offered. These were meager in the eyes of kings, but to these sailors each represented a sacrifice, treasures, or tools that might fetch good coin, or that had personal meaning. Offerings to Aegir and Ran should not be stingy. One gave what one could ill afford to lose, to show reverence. They also brought forth what remained of their ale. Remarkably, one small keg had survived with a few pints inside, now flat and sour, but still ale, and a skin of mead had been saved from the oath-taking night. These would be given up entirely. Gathering around, the crew stood, with heads bowed against the wind. The waves slapped the hull rhythmically, as if the sea itself was aware of the gathering. Thora, being knowledgeable in rites, led the ceremony with Eric. First, Thora invoked Aegir. Hail Aegir, king of the sea, great ale brewer and host of the gods. For legend, said Aegir hosted the gods in his hall and gave them ale. We mortals cross your realm in humble ships. We have felt your strength and beg your goodwill. He lifted the ale keg and poured it slowly over the side, the foamy liquid swallowed by brine. Take this ale, good Aegir, and drink with us in fellowship. May our ship never lack for fair wind and following wave. The men murmured assent. The idea of Aegir as a host was one of those dual aspects. He could be generous, as when he entertained the Aesir, or he could drown sailors. They appealed to his generous side by offering what he loved, ale. Next, Eric spoke to Ran, with a respectful and cautious tone. Ran, Queen of the Depths, we know your net is wide. Many brave men have met you below and reside in your hall now. A collective shudder as they imagine the cold abyss. We ask that you stay your net from us a while longer. Spare us to reach our families and hearths. In gratitude, we give you gold and gifts, so you need not take us as treasure. He took the silver coin and tossed it far into the sea, where it plinked and sank. Others followed. The bone comb, the arrowheads, all cast overboard one by one. Each sank out of sight to Ran's domain. Lastly, the fine sea-axe knife. Its owner kissed the blades flat in farewell and flung it spinning into a deep swell. It was hard for him. That blade was an heirloom, but the splash it made somehow felt significant, as if the sea accepted it with a gulp. The men stood in silence, only the winds whistling around them and water lapping. Thora then led a chant in Old Norse, a repetitive, song-like prayer. Aegir, let our keel be swift. Ran, let no harm come. Below, Njord, blow fair wind adrift. Thor, defend from every foe. They repeated these lines, a droning chorus carrying over the water. Some closed their eyes, swaying softly with the ship's motion, entering a meditative rhythm. In that moment, each man cast his inner fears and hopes into the Darbing incantation, binding their fates to the mercy of the elements they named. After the prayer, they decided on a small blood offering, common in Norse rituals known as blot. They had no animal to sacrifice. The goat they once had was eaten long ago, so they offered their own blood in token. At Eric's nod, several stepped forward, pricking their forearms with the point of a spear. Not deeply, just enough that droplets of red beaded on the skin. These they smeared on a wooden bowl with some remaining mead and seawater mixed in. Thora took this concoction, and with a first sprig, he dipped and sprinkled it around, a symbolic blessing or placation to the gods. Scarlet drops spattered the deck and their clothes. Normally, in a temple, this would be done on statues of gods and participants as a sanctification. Here, the ship was their temple, and it too was anointed, as were they. The effect of these rituals was as much psychological as spiritual. The crew felt a sense of relief and empowerment. They had not been passive victims of fate. They had engaged with it, bargained with it, shown humility and honor. Whether or not one believed Aegir or Ran truly heeded, each man's heart was lighter for having done all he could to secure providence. And strangely, shortly after, the weather, which had been grim in the morning, began to shift. The cloud cover thinned slightly to the west, allowing a pale glow of late afternoon sun to beam through in places. The wind, which had been blustery and uncertain, settled to a steady northeaster. This was not dramatic, no sudden miraculous calm or change, but it was enough to raise eyebrows among the crew. Could it be the offering was accepted? Some exchanged hopeful grins. Superstition or not, they chose to see it as a good sign, a path opening, the gods placated for now. Even Ulf, still recovering, stood with help during the ritual, and afterward claimed he felt better. Ran must have released my lungs, he said with a weak chuckle, for I breathe easier now. In truth, maybe the berry tonic and rest were helping, but why not credit divine grace too? They cleaned up the altar, tossing the now empty barrel into the sea as one more offering. As it bobbed away, Hakon quipped, "There goes a good barrel. Aegir, enjoy the brew." They laughed, genuine laughter not heard in a while. It was as if a gloom had lifted. Evening came on with a gentle clarity. The horizon glowed a faint amber beneath the cloud bank as the sun, unseen, set beyond. The sea was relatively calm, and for the first time in days, stars winked in breaks of the cloud above. The men set their course by those stars with renewed confidence, as if assured now that the cosmos was with them, not against them. That night, they spoke softly of homecoming, a topic they had avoided when things looked dire. Now, warmed by a modest success, the landfall, and the spiritual solidity of the offering, they dared to visualize the end of their journey. They discussed which port or fjord they might first see, who would likely spot them from shore, how word would spread of their survival. "My wife will probably box my ears for worrying her so," one man joked, "before she kisses me to death." Another fantasized about the hot bath he would take, an almost unknown luxury. But after this cold, Even a tub of heated water by the fire was not too much to dream. Eric, listening, allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The hardest part of a leader's role in such expeditions was to keep hope kindled. This day, the combination of tangible nourishment from the Isle and emotional sustenance from the ritual had stoked that flame bright. Offerings to Aegir and his kin had not been in vain. Of course, they were not out of danger yet. Winter still held its grip on the world, and open seas are ever capricious. But the crew faced what came next with a new equilibrium. Should another storm gather, they would trust that maybe Aegir's daughters, the waves, would treat them more gently. If another calm trapped them, perhaps Njord, or even Aegir himself, would eventually send a breeze to carry them on, having tasted their ale and found it good. And if death did come in some form, they could at least feel they went with honor, having paid their due respects. It was just past midnight, under a sky swirling with patchy clouds and moonlight, when one of the men on the forward watch shouted in surprise, "Fire on the water!" The others hurried to look. Indeed, alongside the hull, in their wake, trailed a stream of phosphorescent glow. Marine algae stirred to luminescence. It sparkled blue-green, eerily similar in hue to the aurora they'd seen nights before. The Longship seemed to cut through a field of tiny stars in the sea itself. The Vikings marveled. Some had seen this phenomenon before, near coastal inlets in summer. Few expected it in winter's cold. It felt like another blessing. Aegir's fire. They named it on the spot, as if the sea giant acknowledged their offering by lighting their path. It buoyed their spirits further. They leaned over, trailing hands to agitate the plankton, leaving glowing contrails through their fingers and laughing like children. That luminous display stayed with them for an hour or more, until waters cooled, or the concentration passed. But by then, most of the crew had dozed off, serene with contentment and a touch of wonder. Only the helmsman and a watcher stayed up, both quietly humming a sea shanty as a lullaby for their mates. Thus, having given gifts to the sea, the crew felt the sea gave signs. Back, subtle, perhaps coincidental, but meaningful to them. In times of dire uncertainty, such exchanges meant everything. It wasn't purely superstition. It was about feeling not alone in the vastness, forging a relationship with the environment around them. They had shown respect, and in doing so, regained some sense of agency. For the rest of that night, and into the clear dawn that followed, Havbrave sailed steadily on. The water had an almost friendly sheen, and the wind's tune in the sail was low and steady. When Eric took a fresh sighting of the sun and stars that dawn, he quietly thanked the gods to himself. They were on course. In the distance, there were hints of a coastline emerging from morning mist. With luck and grace, they would soon reach a safe harbour. The crew awakened to the cry of "land ahead" as pale sunlight broke through clouds to reveal green-black outlines on the horizon, likely the isles they sought or mainland beyond. A ragged cheer went up. Many removed their caps and helmets a moment, letting the sunlight touch their hair, faces etched with gratitude and exhaustion. They had survived storms, cold, hunger, and perhaps they also believed they had survived the capricious whims of the ocean's gods themselves. The offerings to Aegir and Ran were part of that survival, a transaction of humility that gave them courage to carry on. As they steered toward what looked to be a fjord mouth, the helmsman said a final, soft prayer. "Aegir, let us pass into your calm waters. Ran, Keep your net idle. When next we sail, we'll do so with respect and good cheer." And in the gentle splash of waves under their prow, he almost fancied he heard a chuckle in answer. The ocean giant's laughter, deep and far, granting these bold sailors safe passage at last. The storm's lullaby. Not long after leaving the sanctuary of that small isle and their ritual offerings, the Vikings met one more trial of the winter sea, a final crescendo in the symphony of their voyage. It began quietly, almost gently, as many fateful things do. The wind, which had been mild, started to pick up and shift from the west. The air turned sharp as the pressure dropped, a subtle heaviness pressing on their ears. Those with weather wisdom exchanged knowing looks. Another storm was brewing. By late afternoon, the horizon ahead had transformed into a wall of iron-grey cloud, darkening unnaturally early. The sea heaved in long, deliberate swells, like some giant turning in its sleep. Havbrave continued steadily, but the crew prepared. With practiced efficiency, despite fatigue, they double-checked lashings on the sail, secured all loose gear, and dug out spare oars. They donned their driest woolens and oilcloths, bracing for another onslaught of cold rain or snow. Eric had them take in some sail as precaution and set a course as favorable as possible to meet the storm head-on. He murmured to Sven, "If it's like the last one, at least we know we can weather it." Sven nodded, but in his heart hoped it wouldn't be worse. Winter storms were unpredictable. Some blew out quickly, others could chase a ship for days. The first squall hit just after dusk. A curtain of sleet and wind roared across the sea, drenching them anew and cutting visibility to nil. The Longship plunged and climbed over a sudden onslaught of choppy waves. Yet this time, the crew's fear was tempered by familiarity. They moved almost calmly through the motions honed by the last tempest, securing the sail, manning the oars to keep prow into waves, bailing swiftly as water came in. It was as if the previous storm had been a rehearsal, and now they played their parts with grim competence. The howling wind had a different tone, a higher pitch, a keening that wove through the rafters of their minds. It sounded to some like a woman's wail, to others like a chorus of voices. The storm's singing, Leif thought, in a daze as he gripped an oar, face numb with cold spray. That notion strangely comforted him. If the storm had a voice, perhaps it could be lulled or understood. As the gale intensified, something uncanny happened. Amid the chaotic noise, there were moments, a few seconds here, a half-minute there, when the wind's scream modulated, almost like snatches of melody in the noise. It might have been pure imagination, but several men independently felt it. Bjarni, hunkered down and humming a tune to steady his nerves, realized the notes he hummed were occasionally in harmony with the wind's moan. Startled, he actually started humming louder, experimentally. The wind answered, with a shift in pitch through the rigging. He laughed, despite the sting of salt in his eyes. Was he dieting with the storm? Others heard Bjarni's laughter and humming, and might have thought him mad if not for a similar sense tickling their own ears. So, amidst the raging dark, some of them began to sing not a hearty shanty or a prayerful chant as before, but something softer, wordless perhaps, a hum or a melodic ooh sound that they improvised in unison. It was an instinctive, primal lullaby to the ferocious elements. As bizarre as that may seem, humans singing to calm the very storm threatening to kill them, and in their minds, perhaps, they remembered their mothers or fathers singing them to sleep on stormy nights long ago. It was the tone one might use to soothe a frightened child or a wild beast. Low, cohesive, strangely mournful but peaceful notes threaded through the air. The storm's lullaby, one could call it, born right then. Did the storm actually ease in response, or was it chance? It's hard to know, but it's true that, after a time of their gentle singing, the gale seemed to plateau, not worsening to the extremes of the earlier tempest. The waves, though still high and violent, carried a consistency they did not reach the monstrous heights of before, staying perhaps at 10 feet, rough but navigable. The men held, of course, drenched and shivering, but not in utter panic. They were, in a strange way, riding the storm, not just enduring it. Between squalls, in the lulls, they heard each other's voices more clearly. Some actually harmonized a deep baritone here, a wavering tenor there. It was a haunting sound on the wind-swept sea, as if shipwrecked spirits were serenading the night. To any outsider, this might have seemed eerie. To the crew, it was grounding. It reminded them they were alive, together, and still capable of creating something beautiful, even in extremity. It gave their minds focus, beyond raw fear. At one point, thunder rumbled in the distance. Thor's hammer, some thought, though no lightning was seen yet. Styr took that moment to bellow jovially, "Thor, if you'll drum, we'll sing," and he beat his hand on a shield, in time with a particularly strong gust, making a kind of drum beat to which they all hummed. In a way, they framed the storm not as an enemy now, but as an unruly accompanist in this dark symphony. Rain mixed with snow pelted down. The ship's dragonhead prow gaped silently into the spray, its wooden features running with water. By lantern flash, protected under a tarp to not blow out. Some swear the dragon carving looked almost alive, bathed in flickering light and wet, as if breathing. It bobbed and weaved with each wave, leading them through the storm dance. Then came a moment of climax. The wind whipped around to the north. Suddenly an intense gust that heeled the ship hard to starboard. Men shouted as they scrambled to counterbalance, shifting cargo and bodies. A wave crest loomed and slapped the hull violently, nearly broadside. Havbrave rolled. Water cascaded in. For a heart-stopping couple of seconds, it seemed she might capsize. Cries of effort and alarm mingled as everyone leaned or threw weight to help right her, muscles burning. A mighty wave of their own making, all hands shifting port side, plus a bit of luck managed to tilt the Longship back upright in the nick of time. They lost an oar or two and one man nearly overboard. Kolbein clutched the gunwale as his legs were flung out, Svend grabbing his arm in the last instant to haul him back. A collective gasp of relief rang out once stable. In that moment of near disaster, many had fallen silent, bracing. Now, with hearts hammering, a few resumed the humming automatically, a reflex to soothe their jangled nerves. Remarkably, it steadied them all again. Instead of cries of despair, they found their refrain. Some even chuckled breathlessly at Kolbein's wide-eyed expression, patting him. The song became a laugh, became a renewed song, like a mother singing after a child's nightmare. "See, we're all right. Hush now." Thor's distant thunder came again, but no strike hit the sea near them. It was as if the worst had passed. Indeed, not long after that tumultuous hour, the storm began to abate. The gusts lost some fury. The rain eased to cold drizzle. The waves, while still strong, became more regular in pattern, less chaotic. By what must have been midnight, The gale had downgraded to a stiff breeze with intermittent squalls. The crew was utterly exhausted. Some swayed on their feet, more tired than after any battle or labor they'd known. Yet, in their fatigue lay a strange tranquility. They had faced the worst of this second storm with calm and even a sort of gentle defiance. The phrase "storm's lullaby" took root when Leif, half dreaming as he bailed water, murmured, "She sleeps now. The storm, we sang her to sleep." It captured their feeling that the storm had raged like an upset giant, and their collective calm had pacified it. Rationally, they knew storms run their course naturally, but emotionally, this narrative gave them pride and closure. It wasn't that they got lucky with the storm weakening. No, they had tamed it with courage and song. When the clouds broke towards morning, revealing ragged strips of purple-black sky and a waning moon, the crew saw one of the most beautiful sights: the calm after the tempest. The sea was smoothing out, only big rolling, swells remaining, glistening in faint moonlight. A few stars peeked through, and the air, while freezing, had that fresh, washed clarity. They checked for damage. A few lost oars, spares remained. A cracked yardarm. They reinforced it with rope bindings, and everyone thoroughly soaked and Kundarm, shuddering. But the ship was sound and, most importantly, all souls were accounted for. Even Ulf had managed to hang on, lying lashed to the mast base to not be tossed, humming along feebly when he could. Now that adrenaline ebbed, an immense peace and fatigue descended. One by one, men slumped into whatever dryish corner they could find, some not even bothering with cloaks, asleep before they fully closed their eyes. A couple remained on duty to keep the ship oriented and moving slowly, but even they sat, heads nodding. The ocean itself seemed to whisper now, a gentle shh of small waves, the very sound of shushing a baby to sleep. The analogy was not lost on those half awake. They had treated the storm as a fretful child, and now nature treated them in kind, rocking them gently into rest. Eric, fighting sleep a moment longer, looked around at his crew strewn about like shipwreck survivors, but alive. He allowed himself a rare smile. Approaching Sven at the tiller, he clasped his shoulder. No words were exchanged. They both knew what each other felt: gratitude, pride, sheer relief. Eric took the tiller to give Sven a break. In the east, he could just discern the slightest paling of sky. Another dawn was coming, and they were here to see it. As Sven settled down, he said quietly, "That was well done." Eric wasn't sure if he meant the steering or the singing or everything. "Aye," he replied simply. "The storm is our friend now." It was a fanciful statement, but Sven understood. They would not fear the next one so much, having befriended this one. And so the storm's lullaby became another legend among them. In years to come, each man would tell how on that winter night, a Viking crew sang a storm to sleep. It might get embellished. Some would claim the winds literally died at the sound of their voices, others that a dolphin joined their song as a sign from Aegir. But the essence held true. Their unity and calm in the face of chaos is what saved them as much as stout wood and good seamanship. When full dawn broke pale gold and grey, it found the Longship drifting on a placid sea. The sun's rays touched the faces of sleeping warriors who looked strangely childlike in repose, salt-crusted eyelashes and all. Only Eric remained fully awake, steering gently, humming the lullaby tune under his breath. It was soothing to him as well. a reminder of the extraordinary night. He felt a deep kinship with his men and a profound respect for the sea, perhaps even an affection. The ocean felt like part of their crew now, rather than an adversary, a moody, mighty friend they had learned how to soothe. The storm's lullaby thus ended in silence, as all lullabies do when the child finally sleeps. The crew would carry on, journey not quite over, but something fundamental had shifted. They had heard the music of the storm and answered in kind, and in doing so, they realized the line between tenderness in nature is thin, like two sides of a coin. It was a humbling and elevating lesson all at once. Eric saw on the horizon what looked like the silhouettes of mountains or high cliffs, land, and not far. With any luck, by midday, they'd reach a safe harbor. He let the men rest a little longer, content to bear the solitude a while. The sun climbed. The day promised to be fair, and softly on that morning breeze, if one imagined hard enough, one could almost still hear it. A faint melody, the echo of that midnight hymn between men and storm, carrying peace over the once troubled waters. The dawn of hope. When morning light broke after the storm, it felt like the world itself was being reborn. The dawn was gentle and pale, spreading a wash of soft gold and pink across the low clouds. The sea, so malevolent hours before, now looked innocent, long glassy swells reflecting the pastel sky. As the sun's rim peeked over the horizon, the crew of Havbrave stirred from their hard-won rest. Leif was among the first to wake. He raised his head from a coil of rope that had served as his pillow and squinted at the brightness. The cold air on his face was bracing, but it carried the smell of something new, a hint of earth and greenery. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, back home on a spring morning. But no, he was still on the Longship, cloaked in frost. That scent, though, could it be land? He scrambled up, heart thumping, and saw it, faint but unmistakable on the horizon, a dark line of coast. Land! Land to the east! He cried, pointing with a gloved hand. One by one, groggy men sat up, following his gesture. There it was indeed. Not just a small isle this time, but a broad expanse of shoreline stretching north and south, backlit by dawn. It was the coast they'd been seeking, the end of open ocean. A swell of emotion coursed through them. Some whooped, others had tears in their eyes. Ulf, still weak, managed a grin and whispered a prayer of thanks. This was the dawn of hope they had fought for through endless nights and trials. With land in sight, survival was within grasp. They didn't yet know exactly where they were, whether this was friendly territory or some foreign shore, but any solid ground and shelter would do. Eric took the bearing of the coast, comparing to memory and crude maps. By the shape of the mountains inland and the lie of islands off the shore, he surmised they had come upon the southern isles off the mainland, perhaps the Orkneys or maybe the north of Scotland. It mattered little. They would find a harbour to land, rest, and then navigate home along coasts. The hardest part, crossing the winter, open ocean, was over. As they approached cautiously, the crew made themselves as presentable as possible. Despite exhaustion, they tidied the ship and themselves. They refastened loosened armor bits, straightened clothes, even ran fingers through tangled beards. This was partly practical, to not appear pitiable or savage to any locals, and partly pride. They were Vikings and would arrive with heads high. Leif tied the tattered remains of their once bright striped sail properly so it flew like a banner in the morning breeze. It was faded and salt-stained, but still the red and yellow stripes could be seen, a sign of their identity. The wind, as though truly now an ally, picked up from the west, pushing them gently towards shore. They unfurled more sail and stowed oars to let the breeze do the work. As Havbrave glided over the calm swells, the men took in the glorious details of the landscape resolving before them. Cliffs of chalky white in places, elsewhere rolling hills of heather and grass. They could make out a beach where waves lapped softly. Above, seabirds flitted. Gulls, yes, but also the distinctive black and white of puffins and razorbills. The sky was alive with their calls. After the silence of open sea, the raucous noise of a seabird colony was delightful. "We're near a nesting ground," Arnor commented, recalling that some isles here were famous for birds. That meant eggs, maybe even people, for people often visit such places to be food. As they neared an inlet that looked promising, they kept eyes peeled for any sign of habitation. A wisp of smoke, a boat, perhaps grazing animals on shore. They saw nothing obvious from afar. It seemed a quiet, wild coast. Eric decided to assume it might be sparsely settled. Still, they remained alert. Vikings were sometimes as wary of stumbling into an enemy ambush as any prey animal sniffing a waterhole. Weapons were checked, but kept sheathed unless needed. They intended a peaceful landfall if possible. The keel grated softly on sand as they beached in a sheltered cove where a small stream met the sea. The crew leapt out into the shallow, cold water, cheering as they did so. The feel of sand under boots was marvelous. They pulled the ship securely ashore above the tide line. They had made it. Relief beyond words washed over them, along with the chill of the water on their legs. Some men simply fell to their knees on the wet sand, offering silent thanks, running grains between their fingers to prove it real. Others trudged a few steps inland and collapsed on the grass, laughing at the softness compared to deck planks. It was a collective catharsis. After a time, Eric organized small teams to scout and gather. Caution and survival instinct hadn't left them entirely. 2 men scaled a low rise to survey for nearby villages or threats. They returned with news that they spotted distant sheep on a hillside, but no people visible. Likely a pastoral area, maybe a farmstead, further inland. Thora, Svend, and a few others refilled water skins at the stream, and then, joyful with curiosity, even took off boots to soak sore, frostbitten feet in the cool fresh water. It stung, but felt healing. They collected driftwood and started a fire openly. The smoke curling up in the benign morning felt like a victory banner. Over that fire, they warmed themselves and roasted the last bird they had caught on the isle. They'd saved 1 cormorant for this moment, imagining fresh roast on land. It was stringy and fishy as before, but eaten on solid earth with the smell of turf and wood smoke around. It tasted like the finest roast swan. 1 man found wild leeks and nettles by the stream and added them to a makeshift stew. The first greens in ages drew appreciative groans as the pot was passed. Even the nettles, which stung his hands to gather, were devoured eagerly for their fresh flavor and likely the revitalizing nutrients their bodies craved. As they ate, they reminisced. It was midday now, sunny with scudding clouds, almost mild in temperature compared to what they'd endured. The crew lounged around the fire in various states of repose. They were safe, bellies fuller than in weeks, and their eyes shone with that unique clarity that comes after survival. They recounted the worst moments, the huge wave that nearly took them, the night their breath froze in their beards, the day without any food when Kolbein suggested chewing leather. They had tried, only to spit it out. Now these were like badges of honor in story form. They pointed to scars and frostbite marks and chuckled. This one I got when Thorvald dropped the pot on me in that gale. And here, my thumb, almost bitten off by Ulf, when I made him drink that bitter tea. Ulf blushed, and everyone roared with laughter. They also spoke of the best moments, the Aurora night and oaths, the salmon practically jumping into their laps, the eerie sea fire glowing around them after offerings, the storm lullaby. These had already 210, become almost mythical in their minds. Leif joked they should hire a skald, poet, to immortalize this saga when home. Styr, the impromptu storyteller, enthusiastically began composing a silly rhyming couplet about how they sang the sea to sleep. It was crude and comedic, and exactly what they times big needed. Tears of mirth rolled as he used over-the-top kennings, poetic phrases, like calling the Aurora Valhalla's laundry hung in the sky, and their ship a nutshell on Rand's bathtub. If an outsider heard, they'd find it outrageous. But among tired, happy survivors, gallows humor is gold. Eric watched his men with quiet pride. Each of them had proven himself tenfold. The hierarchy that had existed at voyage start, the seasoned versus the green, the free men versus the thrall, if any were present, seemed irrelevant now. They were truly a brotherhood forged by adversity. Eric knew he would recommend generous rewards to any under his command when they got back to their patron or king, for they deserved it. As afternoon lengthened, they turned thoughts to the next steps. They needed to determine their exact location and how to get home or to a friendly settlement. But nothing felt urgent at this immediate moment. They had weathered the worst of the Viking winter at sea. Now, on land, in reach of people, it would be comparatively easy. Svend proposed they light a signal fire on a promontory at dusk, in case there were Norse settlers nearby who'd recognize it, and come. Many Vikings had colonies or allies, even in far-flung islands, after all. At worst, locals might come cautiously to investigate, and they could trade, or at least learn directions. They all agreed that tonight, however, they would rest properly. A couple of small tents were pitched using the sail and oars. Finally, a dry place to sleep. Everyone looked forward to truly stretching out, without rolling waves under them. Some even joked they'd miss the rocking. "I still feel the sway when I shut my eyes," said Arnor, and others agreed, a common sensation after long at sea. Before sunset, they did one more ritual, a simple toast to the dawn of hope. Using a horn filled with fresh water, alas, no ale left, they formed a circle by the fire. Eric spoke solemnly, "We left as sojourners and arrive as survivors. Let us thank the gods, the spirits of land and sea, and our own lucky stars that we see this dawn." Each in turn then spoke a word over the horn. Some said, "Skål," cheers, some the name of a god, some just thanks, and sipped, passing it around. It was their quiet celebration of life. The sun set in a serene blaze of orange and lavender over the ocean behind them. How different this sunset felt from those at sea. Here they stood on firm ground watching it, having conquered the intervening distance. One could almost see a symbolic path on the water where they'd come, though in truth it vanished into the horizon. Stars ignited, one by one, in a clear sky. Instead of a fearful omen of another long, dark, They twinkled benignly like familiar friends. The crew settled into watches, still prudent, but those off-duty crawled under the sail tents or near the fire and drifted into perhaps the best sleep of their lives. Leif, before sleeping, found himself staring at the North Star. How many nights had that star guided them or given hope? He felt a swell of gratitude and a strange kinship with it now, as if it were an old mentor. He whispered a goodbye and thanks to it, knowing tomorrow or soon he'd not need it so direly. In the morning, likely they'd make contact with locals or sail further along coast to find a known Viking outpost. But for now, they embraced this interval of peace like a warm embrace. The nightmares of freezing waves and endless emptiness were already beginning to scar over in memory, replaced by the bright promise of rejoining the living world of mead halls, families, and green fields. This dawn of hope was not just the literal sunrise on land. It was the dawning realization that they had accomplished something tremendous. Each man felt it warming him from within, stronger than any hearth fire. They had journeyed through the worst a Viking winter at sea could throw, and they had survived together. The tales they would tell would grow, but the camaraderie forged, and the personal transformations, these would be the lasting treasures. As the first lark trilled in, the pre-dawn of the next day, the crew roused in good spirits. Ulf could walk on his own. Kolbein's frostbitten toes were healing. Everyone's chapped faces looked less ghastly with rest, and some foraged herbs Thorar had applied. They prepared to sail south along the coast under clear skies, but not before carving a rune on a stone near their landing. It was customary for Vikings to mark significant sites. They etched an inscription in runes. We, seafarers of the north, landed here in the harsh winter. The gods favored us. It was a humble marker of their triumph. Pushing off that, shore was markedly different from every other departure on this journey. They were not venturing into peril unknown, but toward home, step by step. The Longship, lightened of fear, and now almost a friend itself, glided eagerly. A few men turned back to wave at the receding beach, as if saying, farewell to an old adversary turned teacher. The coast unfurled with villages and ports as they moved along. By midday they encountered fishermen who gaped to see a battered longship from the north in this season. Friendly contact was made. Language was a bit different, but enough Nordic similarity. The fishermen guided them to a nearby Norse settlement. It turned out to be in the Orkney Islands, where many Norse had settled. There, finally, they were welcomed properly, with hot food, ale, and safe haven. Messengers would be sent to notify kinsmen of their whereabouts, and when spring arrived in earnest, they would sail the relatively short hop over the North Sea home to Norway. But those logistics hardly mattered in the flush of safety. That evening, a feast was held in the Orkney Hall for these unexpected winter wayfarers. The crew of Havbrave were guests of honour, plied with roasted lamb, creamy fish, stew, bread, butter, all the things they had dreamed of. They recounted their saga to wide-eyed listeners by the fire, playing up the dramatic bits for effect. When they described the Aurora oaths, or how they sang down a storm, some listeners glanced at each, others skeptically. Sailors are known to exaggerate, but the haunted, earnest look in the eyes of these survivors convinced them that, embellishment or not, there was truth in those tales. As Leif drifted to sleep that night, on a soft hay-filled bed in the hall's loft, he thought about the past, journey's trials, and the promise he made under the northern lights, to make his father proud and remember those lost, though thankfully all had lived. He knew he was forever changed. The roaring sea, the endless night, the biting cold, all those he once feared or never imagined, were now part of him, tamed in memory. He felt older than his years, but also wiser and strangely gentle. Adversity had carved compassion and resilience in him that a peaceful life might not have. Likewise, each man of the crew, in his own quiet reflections, felt something similar they had confronted. Nature at its fiercest, and also touched moments of profound beauty and brotherhood. They would return to ordinary life, but carry a bit of the wild winter ocean in their souls, a reminder of both their vulnerability and their strength. The dawn of hope that had guided them to land would guide them in life. In years hence, when comfortable by a hearth, if any became arrogant or complacent, they could recall how the sea can humble the mightiest. And if ever they felt despair at challenges on land, they could remind themselves that if they survived a Viking winter at sea, they could survive anything. In the morning, a fair wind blew from the north. Havbrave, repaired and resupplied, set sail with her crew toward home shores, accompanied partway by Orkney allies. The sun rose higher, days growing longer as spring tiptoed in. On the horizon lay Norway, not far now, with families waiting with anxious hearts, soon to be eased. As the distance to home shrank, the men would sometimes hum the old lullaby, tune, or speak of the aurora. Other times, they sailed in contented silence, each lost in anticipation of reunion. They were lucky. Many crews had not returned from winter voyages. They knew this keenly, and a solemn respect underlay their joy. Finally, one crisp, clear morning, familiar fjords opened before them. Green pines, snows on peaks, the smell of home on the breeze, indescribable bliss. Horns were blown, signals exchanged, and soon the dock was in sight, where wives, children, parents, friends gathered, alerted by watchers on hills. The landing was a blur of tears and laughter, embraces and incredulous gazes at the rugged survivors who had been given up for dead. It was said that at the homecoming feast that followed, no singer or skald could match the passion with which the crew themselves recounted their saga. It became local legend, and then beyond. You wouldn't survive a Viking winter at sea, people would say to those complaining of trifles, invoking the story as a benchmark of hardship and resilience. And indeed, most wouldn't survive it, but they did. The crew of Havbrave, now heroes in their villages, never forgot the gifts of that journey, the closeness to each other, the faith in gods and selves, and the appreciation for life's simple sweetness, like a dry bed, a warm stew, a loved one's touch. Each dawn for them now was a dawn of hope. Each winter storm, viewed from inside a cozy hall, was respected like an old adversary, and strangely, friend. When night fell at that reunion feast, one of the young children begged, "Tell us the story of the storm lullaby." And though some men demurred with a smile, another time, "Child, it's long." Old Styr cleared his throat. In the fire-lit hall, he sang softly the eerie tune they had hummed on the sea, as all listened in rapt silence. He ended with a gentle, almost whispering cadence, like putting a child to bed. By thee, last note, many eyes were moist, for the memory was still fresh and cutting. Then Styr raised his cup and said, "We sing of waves and night and fear, but also of dawn and hope and cheer. Skal, They all drank deeply, to hope, to dawn, to life. Outside, the stars glittered coldly, indifferent as ever, but inside that hall was warmth and hope unvanquished, passed from survivor to neighbor to child, like torches sharing flame. Thus ends the saga of those who braved the winter sea and returned. Their story became a lullaby of its own, one to reassure frightened hearts that even the darkest winter yields to dawn, and that courage and kinship can outlast the fiercest storm. And on nights when storms howl beyond the shutters, perhaps one might hear, if listening closely, a faint hummed melody through the cracks, a reminder of the men who sang a storm to sleep and lived to see the kindly light of day.